All right, Bloomberg's Markets Live executive editor Mark Cudmore joining us around, well, from Singapore, actually. I was going to say around the table.
Services number, so that could push some of the mining stocks a little higher.
Yeah, all of this, though, I suspect, Anna, is going to fall foul of the idea that actually there's a bigger story, and that's the US election. So single stocks, you may get a little bit of movement. Salzgitter can certainly be one of those. So here's the opening trade. Let's talk about the numbers. Could take a little while to get Germany open this morning. But the FTSE's out of the gate, a little soft already, but not down by much. The next few hours could be really volatile. I mean, the next 24, 48 hours could be really volatile. How much positioning is there really in the market? Either way, I suspect a lot of people have got their books fairly neutral. Our equity is going to be the beneficiary regardless of who wins. That's a tough call to make maybe at this stage. So European equities this morning, very flat. You can see it already on the screen. The Stoxx 600 barely budging. The FTSE's down by less than 1/10 of 1%. The CAC's up a little bit, but not by much. The IBEX is open, down by 0.2 of 1%. I think we're going to have to wait a little while for the DAX to get going this morning, but I suspect probably signalling something similar. But some single stocks could be quite interesting. So let's talk about the sector story. Let's talk about the single stock story. Critty, what are we seeing?
Well, tech seems to be on the back foot this morning. When you look at the index contribution from it, the biggest weights that you're seeing, I'm seeing ASML take a little bit of a hit here this morning, Schneider Electric as well, Anna, but alongside some of the actually renewables makers, and so that's going to be more of an earnings story. Ørsted, for example, Vestas certainly in focus. We'll get those quoted for you in just a few minutes, but we are seeing outperformance on the other hand in France, as Guy mentioned, and a lot of that is led by luxury. So again, it seems to be the story between luxury and tech, both heavyweights, both opposite trades this morning.
Yeah, in terms of that renewable energy story, then we do see considerable weakness in the Vestas share price, down by 4.5% this morning. There was at the EBIT margin level that slight downgrade to what they expect to achieve there, so that's certainly something we're watching. Ørsted also out with numbers in that sector, and that stock down by 1.3%. So we continue to watch that sector, and we'll have a conversation with the management of Vestas a little bit later on in the programme. In terms of the other movers, then, Critty, you've been through some of the sectors that are on the move this morning. We're waiting for some of the individual stocks that we put in focus this morning to actually open up. Some of those have not opened. But yeah, basic resources, the best performing sector on the back of some of that China news flow, it would seem.
Yeah, I'm waiting for a Salzgitter share price that I think could take some time to get going. Looks like we could see a significant amount of movement in that stock. We'll get Vestas very shortly. That is certainly going to be one of the companies that could be affected by what happens in the United States in terms of policy regarding offshore wind in particular. But European stocks certainly watching very carefully what happens over in the United States. Tariffs has been a story for European investors as they watch what could come out of this. What have the presidential candidates been saying about this? Let's take a listen.
Tariff, tariff, tariff. I am a tariff man. To me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff.
The Trump administration resulted in a trade deficit, one of the highest we've ever seen in the history of America. He invited trade wars.
I want to cut taxes on Americans while putting tariffs on China and foreign countries.
Focusing on relationships with our allies, focusing on investing in American-based technology.
Build your plant in the United States and you don't have any tariffs.
Okay, tariffs are on the agenda. Emmanuel Carr, head of European Equity Strategy at Barclays, joining us now around the table. Is that tariff story priced?
I think it is partly priced, Guy. We've seen a bit of discrimination in the market over the past few months on the expectation Trump will be winning, so there's a lot of pre-positioning in the market on the back of this kind of expected Trump win, and some of that is reflected in the underperformance of European equities, Asian equities, Mexican equities, and within Europe, we have a basket of tariff names which has been underperforming by 15% over the past 3 or 4 months. So yes, I think the market is quite worried, quite nervous about the names that will be impacted by those tariffs.
So if Harris looks like she's going to win, if we're going to see a Harris presidency, do I buy those stocks? Is that the first and most obvious trade that I should be looking at?
I would think so. I think the asymmetry, tactically, is a bit more in favor of Harris trades, in the sense that the market is quite long Trump, even though some of it has been reversed in the last few days. But yes, tariff names in the cyclical space, in particular in Europe, stock exposed to China, are the names that could bounce first if you have a clear outcome tomorrow.
Emmanuel, I'm interested in your sense of how much we have seen pricing out of Trump trades in recent days. Have we seen much? I was reading in a different asset class entirely. I was reading somebody's research on what we saw on bond markets and the yield story there, and saying actually the fact that we saw yields go up on Friday, but then only came down to 4.3% or so, was suggesting to this bond analyst that maybe actually it wasn't really all about Trump in the first place. There was something else in the mix as well. I mean, to what extent do you think we have seen pricing out of Trump trades?
I don't think we've seen much. I mean, clearly there are a lot of factors in play. We've seen, on top of Trump being priced in, stronger data in the US driving this reflationary impulse in the market. And look, in the last couple of days, we had this betting odds, which the market has been following closely over the last few months, somewhat narrowing again in favor of Harris. So the market was very comfortable with Trump winning as a base case, and obviously in the last couple of days, betting odds are shifting towards Harris again, so the market is just following that, right? So we've seen rates going down a bit, dollar coming down a bit. We've seen some of these reflationary winners taking a bit of backset, but definitely market, I think, is still positioned for this reflationary impulse that would come with a Trump win. And as we said, I think the tariff name and stocks outside the US are still lagging significantly.
Do we need to, in terms of how much discount, if we get a Trump win, when we're thinking about the discount that Europe should trade at, does this depend on whether there's a red sweep, or is that aside from the red sweep? What should we watch for to assess the level of Europe discount that should apply under a Trump presidency?
Well, I don't think the Congress matters so much for Europe, because what matters a lot for Europe is tariff, and tariff can be enacted even without a red sweep, right? So I think for the US, if you have a red sweep, that's maybe a more favorable outcome, because you can get this reflationary policies, these tax cuts, this deregulation to offset some of the tariff impact. On Europe, you won't get that. You would get the full hit from tariff, assuming they are enacted, assuming it's not just negotiation tactics, and we won't know for some time, right? So I think the market will be quite worried about, buying the dip in some of these names if Trump is indeed the winner tomorrow.
It feels like so much of the read-through from this election is through the lens of tariff policy. And I'm curious how much of it maybe should be through the lens of deficit, tax changes, et cetera, especially to European multinationals like LVMH, ASML. I know you can't speak to individual names, but when it comes to some of these heavyweights that are driving the European index, aren't they extremely exposed to domestic policy in the United States?
Yes, obviously some of that is true. I guess if you look at the US, and that's why I think the color of the Congress or the direction of the Congress will matter a lot, because you could have significant reflationary package with tax cut and deregulation, which will be quite bullish, I think, for a number of US domiciled companies. Some of the names listed in Europe exposed to the US could benefit as well. And you could even believe that if the US consumer ultimately get the boost from this tax cut and reflationary policies, that might help businesses or demand for some of these exposed names we have in Europe. But I think in the grand scheme of things, trade is still the main issue. A lot of stocks in Europe are global cycle plays. They care about demand in China. They care about global demand. And I guess if you see trade issues and constraint, I think that will be another drag on some of these names. Obviously, Chinese outlook is quite important as well. There's a lot of focus on US policies, but in the background, we are seeing some early sign of stabilization in Chinese data. So something to watch as well. But as you said, I think tariffs are the main discriminant factors for the trade in Europe.
Well, you bring up China, and one of the crucial pieces we've been talking about around the show has just been, when we look at some of the policies come out of China, what does European policy look like in response to some of that could then more directly affect the regional stocks? And I'm curious, in the context, again, of the U.S. election, are there any European policy changes that could come to the forefront in response to the United States that may change the game for, say, French tech, for example?
Well, I think the big issue is that you get some retaliation against U.S. tariff. And again, we won't know for some time. If you think about the 10% tariff impact on earnings, on growth, is very minimal. But if you think about a broad, scale, a larger trade war that would get China, that would get Europe to retaliate against U.S. tariff, and that's why you can get a significant hit to growth, right?
What sectors would that fall under, though?
Well, I would say, pretty much everything in cyclicals. But if you think about some of the consumer names, the tech names, some of the industrials, that's where I think you would get a significant hit. These things are global trade players. They have been benefiting from globalization over the last couple of years. Margins have been very strong. Pricing power has been very strong. Cost has been, maintained relatively low. If you get trade friction more and more, I think there's going to be a hit on profitability, and the valuation will have to reflect some of that.
How sensitive are European stocks to higher US yields, which may come with a Trump presidency?
They are quite sensitive, and I think this is something to watch, I would say, first thing tomorrow. What is the bond market telling us? At face value, you can say Trump policies might be quite reflationary, deregulation, lower taxes could help, but if this is coming with a bit of stress in the bond market, I'm not sure the equity market will like it. And definitely in the last couple of weeks, we've seen, even in Europe, bond yields moving higher in sympathy with the move higher we saw in the US bond market, in US yields as well, right? So if you see a broad risk-off in rates on the back of this fiscal indiscipline that the market is getting worried about, look at the UK budget last week, I think that might create a bit of stress across markets.
Okay. How are you preparing then, Emmanuel? How are you preparing for the next, is it 24 hours, 48 hours, the next week, the next 2 months? You tell me. What is the sense? Where's the focus of activity going to be? I mean, clearly you can't take your eyes off anything that happens in the next 24 hours, I suppose, when it comes to the election results. But do you have a sense at Barclays as to when you're preparing to know something material?
So our plan is to go to bed early tonight and to wake up early tomorrow morning and see what happens.
That's every day for us.
This is a good plan.
Nothing unusual, but maybe a bit earlier than usual tomorrow morning. Look, I think what we want to find out tomorrow is whether you have a clear winner and the process to get there is smooth. If you have a disputed election or very, very narrow gap between the two candidates, I think it's going to take a bit of maybe stress in the market to get there. Think about 2000, where back then, a long time ago, but there was a very narrow gap between Bush and Al Gore, and it took a month for those votes to be recounted, and the market was on 10%. There was a proper risk-off, right? So I'm not saying this is a base case we have now, but if the polls are right, and polls are very, very tight, I would expect the uncertainty maybe to last a few more days. Look, ultimately, I think the election will, or might be acting as a clearing event. What you want is some certainty. You want to know who is going to be in charge in the US for the next 4 years. And once you find out, you know what to expect. You know where to invest, and that could somewhat unleash animal spirit. How do you get there is a question, and I suspect the market will wait to see some clarity on that before taking strong views and strong positions.
In terms of, you mentioned that volatility as well around the disputed election, but what if there isn't a disputed election, but there is volatility in terms of domestic violence or something like that? Is that something that the markets may be sensitive to?
Well, look, we had some of that 4 years ago, right? And ultimately, I think the market did not buy into this threat that Trump was making. So I think if the result is pretty clear and should not be disputed, yes, you may have some unrest here and there. But I think the market will probably focus on the fact that you have a clear outcome. And yes, it might take a few more days for stability to come back, but ultimately, from a policy standpoint, you know what to expect, right? So I think that's what market wants, some clarity and certainty on the policy setup for the next 4 years.
An early night for Emmanuel Cao. Nice to see you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Emmanuel Cao, Head of European Equity Strategy, joining us from Barclays. Let's take a look at the core six this morning, see what is moving at the centre of the European equity story. We're going to get Ferrari numbers a little bit later on today. Keep an eye on what is going to happen there. Broadly, though, we are in risk-off territory, as you can see. LVMH softer, which is interesting given what we've seen out of China this morning. ASML is softer. Schneider is softer this morning, down by 0.7%. A little bit of safety maybe in Nestle, but look at Novo, down 1% as well. We look forward to its numbers. Single stocks, there are a few that are moving this morning. Joe Easton has the details.
So here's a move in Carrefour this morning over in France. Now remember, a Bloomberg exclusive overnight saying that the company is looking at potential ways to boost its valuation. Now this could potentially include selling some real estate assets, potentially even entering new partnerships with other retailers, according to the report as well. So plenty of options, and even the other final option of big M&A. But bear in mind, a deal with another French retailer was blocked by the French government around 3 years ago. So potentially that is meaning the gains are contained. We're up 1.9% at the moment for that one. The other big M&A story that you guys were mentioning earlier is Salzgitter, are now up 25% for this steelmaker, much more in the mid-cap space over in Germany, worth around €1 billion, but potentially one of their investors looking to do a full takeover if they can get enough other shareholders on board with their plans, according to a report on that one. So a big gain for Salzgitter today. Then over in renewables, this space actually looking pretty weak this morning. We had a couple of reports out. Vestas down another 8%. Now, bear in mind that stock has already come off quite a lot already over the past year or so. Weak earnings in terms of their guidance at the lower end. We've also had numbers from Ørsted. Those were looking pretty steady, but potentially the Vestas numbers weighing across the entire sector. We see we've got Siemens Energy on the screen as well. That stock's done really well, but potentially, as I say, Vestas weighing on that sector this morning with those weaker than expected margin numbers. Then in terms of the other earnings, one stock really standing out to me was Schroders, down 12% at the moment. Now, that is the biggest decline since the pandemic days of 2020. Now, they have seen around £2 billion worth of outflows in the latest period, and analysts ahead of the report were saying we might have actually seen an inflection because of the changing political scene in the UK, but we haven't seen that, and a real shock for Schroders' share price today, down 12% at the moment. In terms of the apparel retailer, Primark holding up pretty well over at AB Foods, and Hugo Boss actually did see an 8% decline in their Asia sales in the last period, kind of in line though with what we've already seen from the luxury space, so potentially priced in for that one. And finally, down the bottom in medical tech, Ambu over in Denmark, once again that one hit a series of profit warnings from the Danish medical tech firm, coming down almost 15% this morning. Then quickly on the morning calls, we got a couple in the aviation space today. This one was standing out. Air France down to underweight over at Morgan Stanley today. That one coming down 2.5%. They're citing rising debt and weaker cash flow at Air France, according to the firm. And then finally, Ryanair. We did see a little bit of a decline in that stock yesterday. I did think potentially the news around the Boeing strikes would be a positive for this company today, but we got Peel Hunt cutting the stock, cutting it down to hold. That one falling at 1% following a Peel Hunt downgrade. They are citing a rising fuel for Ryanair, so getting another hit on that stock in Dublin this morning.
Joe, thank you very much. Joe Easton with a briefing, all the equities in focus, big picture stories, but also the individual names cutting through this morning. There aren't many of them, but there are some, as he's just been through. 8:16 here in London, election day in the United States. That, of course, is the big picture narrative that hangs over all of the market moves. We'll get back to another important story that really does link up with the politics, though. A breakthrough for Boeing's new CEO as striking workers vote to accept the latest pay offer. We'll look at what the future holds for the US aircraft maker. That conversation is next. This is Big Pack.
Asia is at the forefront of some of the world's biggest stories. I'm Sherrian in Tokyo.
And I'm Heidi Stroud-Watts here in Sydney, where the trading day begins. We're here in the centre of all the action to get you set up with the numbers, news and knowledge you need for the day ahead.
The demand is indeed recovering. We've been waiting for this moment.
The opportunity of a century.
Join us on Bloomberg The Asia Trade. Weekdays only on Bloomberg TV. Context changes everything.
Bloomberg Surveillance covers the latest in global markets and the political events that influence your world. Join Jonathan Farrell, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything. It's the world's second largest economy with a growing influence in global affairs. But geopolitical uncertainties, deflationary pressures, and questions about foreign investment linger. Bloomberg, the China Show, brings you the unmatched expertise you need to keep track of breaking news, in-depth market analysis, and the most influential newsmakers in and around China. Bloomberg, the China Show. Weekdays around the world right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything. Bloomberg covers the world with unmatched reach and resources. From more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, context changes everything. Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
With the surge in Bitcoin, you have crypto stocks also surging.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people.
This is a political attack, and we must hold our elected officials accountable.
The transactions.
Really a record-breaking moment.
Bitcoin is the exit strategy.
And the technology.
Awareness is going to grow, and these things grow the overall industry.
Crypto as an asset class is here to stay.
Bloomberg Crypto, only on Bloomberg. Your fixed income fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield every Friday right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything. Thursday, the Fed decides.
Is this a Fed just dealing with debt and deficit?
It's about the election. It's about the Fed, especially at a time where you have those yields creeping higher.
Trust Bloomberg to bring you the fastest coverage and exclusive analysis, including Powell's press conference.
We now see the risks to achieving our employment and inflation goals as roughly in balance.
We've got a statement, a decision, and a news conference.
Tune in to Bloomberg Surveillance, the Fed decides, starting at 1:30 p.m. Eastern.
They secured a victory. They voted by 59% to accept the agreement, and they get to move forward. The strike will end, and now it's our job to get back to work and start building the airplanes, increase the rates, and bring this company back to financial success.
Boeing union leader John Holden a few hours ago announcing the end of this long-running strike. 33,000 workers have been out on the picket lines for weeks, but last night they voted to accept the latest pay offer from Boeing. Let's talk more about what is happening here. We're joined by Bloomberg's global aviation editorial leader, Benedict Camel. Benny, let's talk about what has just happened. We get a result, we get a positive result, the workers go back onto the line, but how long does it take to get this company back up and running? How long does it take to get the Boeing plants up and running? More critically, how long does it take to get the supply chain up and running as well?
Yeah, I mean, all of that's going to take quite a long time. We're talking months and not days or weeks. You know, the CEO, Kelly Ortberg, said a couple of weeks ago, it's much easier to turn the switch off than to turn it back on. So that's going to be the crucial part now. You know, all the workers have been off work for more than 50 days. As you said, the supply chain is disrupted by this. Production has come to a standstill. The only planes that they have been producing are in South Carolina. That's a 787 Dreamliner plane. And they've been making about 4 planes of that particular model in a month. So if you think about it, you know, this is a company with tens of thousands of employees and workers making 4 planes a month. So they have to get that back up again. And that was very much sort of the tenor from Holden that we just heard, excuse me. And from also the company saying, we need to get things back up. You know, this is so crucial for morale, for production, for the customers, and not least for finances. So that's really the path forward for the company.
Holden talks about getting the increase in rates and bringing this company back to financial success. 59% of the union voted for this deal. 40% didn't, effectively. Benny, this is a company that has really suffered from culture recently, and I'm wondering whether or not this is a big enough number to signal that actually the entire workforce is behind this deal. Because this is a company that needs to get everybody behind it. It needs to get everybody on board. It needs to get this company moving forward, and everybody needs to be on board with that. Does this result signal that?
In a word, it doesn't. You know, it's what they needed to get it over the line, and I think there was a general sense of weariness. I think the company and the workers and the political field, everyone felt we need a deal. But as you say, 59%, it's not a resounding victory. It's sort of the lowest possible almost that they could have gotten. If you think about it, when they came into this, they had more than 90% turn down the initial offer. Then they had about 60-something% turn it down. So we've moved here, but not far enough probably to really get everyone back on board. My colleague Julie Johnson, she was on the scene when the votes were counted, when the results were announced, and she said there was booing in the room. People were not happy about this. There's a lot of pent-up anger still at the company. There's a sense that for the last decade that workers got shortchanged while management got, you know, quite handily paid. So there's that cultural divide that still exists at the company, and that'll take time to repair. There's a sense that Kelly Ortberg, the CEO, might be the man to get that done, but again, that'll take not days or weeks, it'll be months or possibly even years to get that over the line.
Well, Benny, so the labor story, of course, one headache for Kelly Ortberg. What are the others? What other challenges is he facing long term?
Well, they have to get production back up. That's goal number one. They had a major announcement last week to repair their finances. So those big blocks are sort of out of the way now. At least there's a sort of path forward. But then longer term, they have to think about how do you deal with a new political field that invariably will happen, whoever wins in the election coming up. They will have to think about in terms of how do we go about the next product. There's a new single aisle plane that they'll have to conceive and build. Where will that be built? Will it be built in the Seattle region? When will that come? What might it cost? What are the kind of products we want to see flow into that? All of those things they need to consider. And how do we reshape Boeing going forward? That's another big thing that people are looking at. Is the Boeing that exists today the same that we'll see in 5 years? Will it still be a company built around civil aviation, around defense, around space? Some people say that space might be the weakest link here. So all of those things Kelly Ortberg needs to think about, and we will probably see a very different Boeing in a couple of years than we see now.
But they escaped the worst outcome, I suppose, which would have been that downgrade to the credit rating, Benny. They got through that, managed that. It took $23 billion in extra capital, but they're through that.
Yeah, you're right. That was the big sword that was hanging over them, the downgrade into junk territory. They're still just that one step above that. So it's averted, but, you know, it's bought them some time, but it's not an impossibility that it might not happen in, you know, the next couple of months or years even. So for now, they've got that buffer. They've averted the strike. So all signals sort of point to optimism, but they really have to get the production back online. They have to really start building planes again, quite simply, and probably start thinking quite robustly about what the portfolio looks like going forward, because in the current state, the company is still bleeding cash, and they will continue to bleed cash next year, and they have to stop that sooner rather than later if they want to keep that credit rating.
Benny, thanks very much. Bloomberg's global aviation editorial leader, Benedict Camel, with the latest on the Boeing story. Coming up on the programme, we'll be back with the earnings. Vestas downgrades its EBIT margin guidance, but plenty of interest from the sector in where the winds may blow in today's election, of course. We will talk about renewable energy with the Vestas CEO. This share price really under pressure this morning, down by over 10% right now. We'll get into that conversation next. This is Bloomberg.
Do you think it'll be the case where someday you will be an investment committee or I'll be an investment committee and we just apply AI, decide whether it's a good deal or not, or we're not going to be there anytime soon?
I don't think we'll be there in the near term. And David, because, you know, being on investment committees, there's the analytics of the math. there's the people, and then there's judgment. So analytics and math, I think AI will help us get way more refined. Right now, we have analysts building models upon models. Our typical investment memo is 86 pages. So we could refine that down very, very seamlessly to pieces. The people aspect to it, to make a judgment call on, do I believe this entrepreneur is going to go the next mile? Do I believe that the background of the entrepreneur, who they are, what they stand for, their values, their family, that's the harder one. I think AI is going to take some time to get there. And then the final piece ends up being judgment. And I don't believe we've seen anything yet that gives us a sense of judgment that we're able to apply.
David Weston, join me for the next generation of Wall Street Week, telling stories of capitalism from business, markets, economics, tech, and climate. Each week, we'll go on the road for a look at what lies behind the headlines of today and what will likely be the headlines tomorrow.
Above all else, it's a mission.
Done nothing but grow immensely. To me, that's an extraordinary sign.
We can be the change that we want to see.
Watch the all-new Wall Street Week. More than what you need to know, it's what you need to think about.
From our studios in New York and San Francisco, our expert hosts have the data and analysis about the companies you know and the startups to watch, plus the interviews you don't want to miss. Watch Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow on Bloomberg Technology, the only daily business show dedicated to tech, right in the middle of the trading action, every weekday, only on Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything.
Always on the heartbeat of the tech
spread across global markets.
The real-time data aspect is going to be important.
We're going to bring you expert analysis on that. Sure.
Don't miss Bloomberg's interview with the This is the opening trade. We're 30 minutes into today's session, starting to see a little bit of that maybe marginal positivity get really pared back. But again, very small moves when it comes to these equity indexes across Europe. The stock 600 down about, we'll call it 0.2%. And I'm, again, being very, very generous. Some outperformance in some parts of the market. The FTSE 100, again, flat at the moment. We'll see how that pans out for the rest of the session. In the meantime, one corporate story that, of course, is catching our eye. Vestas shares have plunged after the wind turbine maker said earnings for the full year will be at the lower end of its guided range. Now, the sector, of course, keeping a close eye on today's U.S. election. Back in May, Donald Trump promised to take aim at offshore wind projects, saying they're bad for birds and whales. Kamala Harris, on the other hand, has been a notable supporter of the sector. Let's bring in Rachel Morrison, who leads Bloomberg's coverage of energy in Europe. Rachel, walk us through kind of these two takes on the wind sector. What are these companies maybe looking for in today's election result?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of uncertainty surrounding the outcome of the election for the sector. So the US is really trying to build its offshore wind industry, and there have been some problems. We saw a really terrible year for the offshore wind industry in the US last year. So onshore has still been a strong area for a lot of the European companies in the US. So looking in the election, there will be kind of looking for signs of what will happen with the IRA, the US tax credit system. Most people expect for that to stay in place no matter who wins. But the extension of that, what happens next, will be very important for these companies as they decide how and when to invest their money in the US.
And right back to the here and now, Rachel, we see the Vestas share price under pressure this morning, as I mentioned earlier, down more than 10%. What sense do we get from the story they're telling today? What stood out from these numbers? They seem to be downgrading, but only really at the margin, their EBIT margin.
Yeah, exactly. So in the previous earnings, there was a downgrade for one part of the company, and this is more just saying that they expect earnings to be at the lower end of what they already said. So the market reaction has been quite sharp in contrast to what's actually been said, and I think that's because investors are really looking for signs that everything is back to normal, back to growth, and that has been slower and continues to be slower in certain parts of the business, namely the services sector. So it's really a kind of absence of positive news rather than a particularly negative number that's come out of these results today.
Rachel, thank you very much indeed. Rachel Morrison, who leads our coverage of the energy sector in Europe. Thank you very much indeed. Setting us up for the next conversation, we are joined now by the Chief Executive of Vestas, Henrik Andersen. Henrik, always a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. So revenue was ahead of estimates, but you've narrowed your EBIT, your operating margin guidance to the lower end of the range. You're getting a really big market reaction, a very negative market reaction to the latter. Do you think that's an overreaction? How big a move really is this in what you're telling us about what is happening next?
Yeah, well, for us, we kept the full year. I mean, for Q3, we are executing on a busy Q3. We came out 20% more and higher activity than last year. A lot of questions were raised after our second quarter, both in terms of the power solution. Are we actually turned the corner on the profitability on power solutions? I think we evidenced that after Q3. Where we are now having a 4-quarter improvement in the power solutions of nearly 500 basis points, and everyone can also see with what we have of visibility of the remaining 60 days of this year, that we are coming towards positively towards the end of executing on the lower priced backlog of turbine orders, which will help the company perform significantly better in the future. We also said here on the service side, we are not back to the run rate of what is expected, so a minor adjustment on the service side, and we keep working hard with that business across it. So I will say, actually pretty happy with the busy quarter, and we can see we are making progress again in Q4, which is the real underlying for me, is to see that we are progressing in the business areas right now.
But the fourth quarter is going to have to be sensational to get you to those numbers. How good is the fourth quarter going to be?
Matt tells the story. I mean, we are executing on projects we already know we have and we are fairly advanced in. Of course, always fourth quarter has the degree of uncertainty because the fourth quarter has all of the potential risk of weather and other stuff, which we have had for 25 years. And I think we're taking, of course, a significant progress in the projects we're executing. And as everyone can see, we will be doing, for the first time for a very long time, double-digit EBIT percentages in fourth quarter when we finish it within that guidance. And that's what we are aiming at, and that's what we are executing on, fully committed from the team.
Henrik, you mentioned the services side of things. Some of the analysts going into the numbers today were saying that we'd see a significant improvement in earnings as Vestas makes more money on the service side of the business. You've just said that there are still minor adjustments happening on the services side. So how on track or off track is the services story?
I think it's off track in a sense that we would have liked to reassure people that it's fixed within 90 days, and it's not. We are scrutinizing the business across our operating entities. We are continuing doing that. It performed at EBIT level 16% this quarter. That's disappointing. I won't shy away from that. It's a progress from where we were and also progress from where we aim to be, both in terms of full year and towards next year. But it takes time. We are scrutinizing the business as both in the operating model. We are also scrutinizing a number of areas of parks, wind parks, where we have relationship with customers. So that's a normal, I will call it, diligent. We had a surprise. Personally, I had a surprise when we go back to Q2, and that we have to put right again. Still an enormous good business, still a fantastic, valuable business, both for our customers and also for Vestas and the shareholders. But we have to put it right in that sense. What really
Henrik,
supports it. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, sorry, I was just going to pick up on the capex lines. You've dropped the capex estimate a little bit as well. I wonder what election assumptions you're making in the United States, or what investment assumptions you're making in the United States when you come up with these capex numbers.
No, capex numbers for us is an adjustment of, we have 60 days to go of this year. So part of what we now see is that there was something that was in our capex guidance that simply will drop into next year. So therefore, it's more, when you adjust 200 million euros, it's because the year is now so advanced that we are not able to manage to fulfill that. That's mainly related to some of the ramp up, and it mainly related to some of the tools in and around both our offshore and onshore. But the ramp up is going, and we are seeing that in both the US onshore, and we are seeing that in Europe in offshore.
Henrik, just to follow up on the U.S. election, of course, I'm sure you're watching it as keenly as we all are, but so much of Vestas has, of course, gotten a lot of benefits from the IRA. There's a real chance that in 2 months' time, some of those benefits are going to get rolled back. How are you preparing for that possibility? Does that include perhaps investing more in the likes of the UK, where, of course, the government is far more friendly to those ambitions?
Yeah, no, this end of the day, it comes down to this is not a hitting, this is not one-liners that makes you put thousands of jobs in individual countries. My job is not trying to predict an outcome of today. Our job is to make sure that we work with both sides of the chamber and both sides of the bipartisan in the US. I think history tells a story here. Both parties have for consecutive 30 years prioritized energy capacity build out in the US, whether that was renewable or it was the more traditional energy mix. So for us, we see that continuing. There's no indication of that any of the two parties will turn the back to an energy build out. And let's not forget that IRA has created build out in both factories and projects, which for many reasons are related to nearly 3/4 of the states of the red color. So our job is not trying to go single-handedly on one, but more to work and keep having the market open for positive on the renewable side. And we don't make individual deselection or selection between countries or switch. If UK wants to progress with the ambitious target, they have 30 gigawatt in 2030, then it needs to be based on tangible projects that are permitted and coming through the pipeline to also create manufacturing jobs. Germany is doing it. If I can mention a hire here, Germany is doing it. They will next year probably fast approaching 10 gigawatt in the onshore permitting. So I think that's really, really good.
Well, Henrik, we look forward to having that conversation with you after the U.S. election. But in the meantime, a quick question on China as well, because there is some of the biggest turbine companies there are actually talking about a kind of alliance of sorts. Some are going as far to call it a cartel. In your view, does the wind body need something like that?
No, I can. World global number one in wind. No, we don't work with that. We distance ourselves from that. There's not any customer in the world that would like to have that conversation and be met with somebody who says, I speak on behalf of cartel. So I don't know where the idea comes from. We don't appreciate that. We like to discuss directly with customers and partners on a free basis on how to put the solutions in place. So I sort of say it might work in part of their world. It doesn't work in the world I'm working in.
Henrik, always appreciate the time. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this Q3. We'll look forward to speaking to you when it comes to the fourth quarter. The Vestas CEO, Henrik Andersen. Coming up, as we've just been discussing, it is election day in the USA. We're going to discuss the latest as the Americans head to the polls in person. Peter Trubowitz, director of the Felon US Center at the London School of Economics, is going to be joining us next. This is Bloomberg.
recent years, you created an institute, the Jane Goodall Institute, and what is that designed to do?
Well, that was started in 1977 when by then I had a little research station and 4 of my students were kidnapped and everything shut down. And so some friends of mine said, well, let's start an institute so that this research can carry on. Bless them. So that was 1977, and it was set up to study, conserve chimpanzees and other animals and educate. And it's developed since then. So it's, you know, we've got 27 Jane Goodall Institutes around the world. And then I realized at some point that the African people living in and around chimpanzee habitats right across Africa were struggling to survive. There was crippling poverty, lack of health and education, moving deeper into the forest, being exposed to diseases like Ebola and HIV from the chimpanzees and vice versa. It hit me. If we don't help these people to find ways of making a living without destroying their environment, conservation won't work.
Good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
Welcome back to the opening trade.
This is Bloomberg Technology.
This is the Asia Trade.
You're watching The Close. Welcome to Balance of Power.
This is Bloomberg.
There's no question the Trump administration would come back with very tight restrictions on Iran. In terms of tariffs, you worry that if you go back to tariffs, you take you back to the 1930s where you have retaliation going on. It builds in, I think, the risk is inflation on the one side and the other a slowing global economy. So, you know, we've gotten used over 30 years to an open global economy with a lot of growth. Yeah. And it would really change the boundaries of the global economy.
S&P Global Vice Chair Dan Yergin speaking to Bloomberg at the ADIPEC conference in Dubai. Talking about the US election, it's on everybody's mind today. Market liquidity evaporating, certainly ahead of this huge risk event. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel to talk about what is happening here. Valerie, run us through the scenarios.
Yes, Guy. I read all the research reports so you didn't have to, trying to get a consensus picture across asset classes. Let's start with the best case outcome. For equities, it is a clear winner, and a clear winner quickly. That would see implied volatility collapse across asset classes and the biggest upside for risk assets, just as the S&P 500. When it comes to treasuries, a Harris win in a split Congress is seen as the best bull case for a big rally in the treasury market. And then the dollar is seen as gaining a lot of momentum on a Trump win, and if the Republican Party also sweeps the Congress. Let's flip on and talk about the worst case scenarios here, Guy. Worst case for equities is that we head towards a contested election, that we wake up tomorrow morning, there's still no clear winner, and we might see some legal ramifications come to the fore. For U.S. Treasuries, we could see a big gap higher in yields, a big drop lower in price on a Trump win and a Republican sweep. For the dollar, the worst case scenario is seen as a Harris win and a split Congress. Now let's check on how these assets have been trading this morning. We are seeing a grind higher in Treasury yields, up 2.5 basis points in the 10-year yield. S&P futures treading water, and the Bloomberg Dollar Index is holding on to the losses of yesterday.
All right. Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel walking us through some of the best and worst case scenarios around this election. Already some jitters, as she points out, in this market. Let's continue the conversation. Peter Trubowitz, director of the Phelan U.S. Center at the London School of Economics, joins us around the table this morning. Peter, a pleasure to have you on the program.
Great to be here.
I'm tempted to ask you what you're going to be doing tonight, but I think we all know. Let's start with, I feel like we've talked a lot about Trump and the risks that he provides, but I want to talk about Harris a little bit, specifically in the context of this region and her potential international policy, given that this is a woman who has faced a lot of criticism on things like the border, immigration, but also on this topic of tariffs. Under the Biden administration, hasn't made many changes to some of the measures that were instituted under Trump, and also has never actually been to China. Is her foreign policy kind of track record a concern, or should it be?
Well, I think if Harris is elected, their allies and friends, America's allies and friends, will breathe a pretty large sigh of relief. Having said that, she's untested. Some of the issues you've just raised, generate uncertainty about kind of what she would do on specific issues and so forth. But I think in general what they would expect from a Harris administration is continued American international engagement along the lines of Biden, that she would use a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer when it came to trade and to technology, and that she would work collaboratively, collectively with America's allies on issues like Ukraine or the Middle East or policy towards China. So, I mean, I think in general that would be the sense that she'd move in that direction. Of course, a lot would depend really on how divided the United States is at the end of this election. I mean, let's say she wins, but she doesn't control the Congress. The Republicans take the Senate. They hold the House. That puts a constraint on her, and she would have less latitude to move. And I think no matter which one of them wins, there'll be pressure inside the United States to reduce America's kind of emphasis on Ukraine, that there will be a push, a desire to get some type of negotiated settlement there.
You mentioned the Middle East as well, and this is perhaps what's putting Michigan in play as such a swing state, given that she's losing some of the vote, especially around the Arab American population there. And I'm curious what that policy may actually look like when we know that Trump has stood and has really spoken about his track record on being tough on Iran, specifically around the assassination of General Soleimani. What is potential president or presidential candidate Harris's kind of counter to that? What is her Middle East policy?
We're guessing here and reading tea leaves, but my sense is she would try to pursue the same strategy that Biden has with, at best mixed success in dealing with the situation there. I suspect we would see her press very early on to try to get a ceasefire over Gaza. But I don't think that we would see any kind of fundamental shift in terms of U.S. support for Israel in the region, and that may hurt her in Michigan today.
Thinking about the two candidates and their policy platforms is going to be something we continue to do over days and weeks, well, depending on how close we get to a result here, Peter. But in the moment, I'm also thinking about, it's quite amazing that there do seem to be undecideds in this election, but we hear talk of them. And I wonder how many of them are convinced by what they've heard over the last 24 hours. We saw both the candidates trying to make add celebrity endorsements to what they're doing. So we saw Joe Rogan coming out for Trump, of course. We saw Oprah, I mean, that's no surprise, Oprah, Ricky Martin, Lady Gaga, and others appearing for Harris. Does that matter now? Is that the deciding factor, these sort of celebrity voices throwing their weight into the ring?
I think what both sides are doing is throwing everything against the wall to try to make, to pick up those remaining undecided voters. In general, endorsements don't make a huge difference. So it may be that Rogan's, 11th hour endorsement of Trump moves some young white male voters to come out and vote today. But if you look at the polls, like the Iowa poll that was released over the weekend, or the New York Times poll as well, what it's showing in general is that undecided voters are moving towards Harris. Having said that, it's worth remembering here that a lot of Americans have already voted. So, there's stuff that's baked in here that the undecided voter matters, but what matters also is those tens of millions of Americans who've already cast a ballot based on information that is, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, in some cases, if you're an overseas voter.
Yes, I was going to say some of them perhaps around this desk.
Peter, how familiar do I need to be with the 25th Amendment? Is a vote for Trump a vote for Vance? Is he going to be capable of seeing through 4 years? Are we going to see succession becoming an issue potentially halfway through? And has that been a factor in the background behind this election, do you think?
I mean, perhaps for some voters, if the Harris campaign thought that it could really move undecided voters and swing voters by stressing his age, I think they would have done it.
Yep.
And so, you know, he doesn't have the healthiest diet. He's overweight and so forth. And
he doesn't say that, but yeah.
Yeah, but perhaps, you know, I mean, maybe there are some voters who have voted for Trump and Vance, figuring that Vance will end up becoming the president.
Would Vance be a different president? How different a president could he potentially be?
I think Vance is, Vance has subscribed to many of, most, if not all, of Trump's policies or policy agenda, and especially Project 2025. So, you know, I think what you could expect is that you would see a version of Trump that is perhaps more consistent and less erratic. And I think that is a concern to many swing voters, especially Vance's position on women.
Daniel, we opened this conversation with Daniel Yergin talking about the open global economy being at stake, Peter. I mean, I'm sure people said that when Trump first went into power in 2016.
Yeah.
Is this the same?
I think if Donald Trump is elected, it will goose anti-globalist, nationalist sentiment elsewhere around the globe, in Europe and other places as well. If it can happen in the United States, I mean, that he is reelected after, you know, the 4-year break and with a policy where he is announcing somewhere between 10 to 20% tariffs across the board. And then with respect to China, let's say 60%. He's gone as high as 100%, but 60%. Yeah. I mean, that kind of rattles the cages, I think. And I think that if he's elected, there will be a lot of talk in Europe. There already is about the potential for a Trump presidency, of Trump-proofing, of, you know, retaliatory tariffs. China certainly would not take it lying down. They didn't take it lying down the first term, Trump's first term. So I think what you would see is kind of more deglobalization that, you know, takes place.
Very quickly, I'm putting you on the spot here. I think a lot of Europeans and international watchers want to know, does Trump's legal record matter in this election, or will it in the next 12 months, given that we're still waiting on sentencing?
If Trump is elected, I think one implication there is his legal record doesn't matter. I mean, that's one of the implications. And if he's in as president, he's in a position to completely dismantle at least the federal, legal actions against him. And I think you have to take him at his word that he would. So if Trump is not elected, I think he's got some legal problems ahead of him.
Great to see you this morning, Peter. Thanks for setting us up so nicely in advance of the election. Peter Tribowitz, Director of the Phelan US Centre at the London School of Economics. What are we going to know tomorrow, I guess, is the key question. Are we going to be in will we have a sense of certainty this time tomorrow?
I was reminding myself of 4 years ago, some of the headlines that were moving us around. Threats of legal challenge, yes, weighing on stocks at one point, but then any sense that the blue wave was avoided, as it was in 2020, that was something that sent stocks higher. So, you know, a lot of volatility ahead, Critty.
Lots of volatility ahead, plenty of earnings ahead as well.
Yep, Anna's off to Germany.
Yes, sorry, she's looking at me. I'm thinking, what? Oh, yes, yes, exactly. I'm going to speak to the Commerzbank CEO. That's also coming up tomorrow. Have a good day, everybody. This is Bloomberg.
Start your trading day on Bloomberg Open Interest.
2 hours of single stock stories that are driving the opening bell action. We'll take you to Wall Street, Main Street, the C-suite, and beyond.
These are companies that are growing their market.
The great companies in the U.S. are the companies hitting the cutting edge. That's a different story.
Get the inside track on what's buzzing in markets.
With the players who are shaping the narrative.
If you have bad earnings reports, you're going to get punished.
They're not buying what the industry is selling. Join us on Bloomberg Open Interest. Every trading day, only on Bloomberg.
Politics to the world of business. Joe Matthew and Keely Lines deliver news, insight, and analysis live every trading day. Balance of Power live around the world every weekday, only on Bloomberg.
From the beating heart of global finance, economics, and politics, and wherever newsmakers are moving markets, Bloomberg brings you conversations that allow for deep discussions and important insights. What do you think the future is for inflation? Is this a new normal? Are markets too optimistic? How do you worry about the things that are outside your control? How does the current fighting completely stop? I'm Francine Lacroix, and this is The Pulse, every weekday only on Bloomberg.
There is this real momentum from Wall Street. We are basically deep in the European earnings season.
Take a look at how we're faring when it comes to Asian markets.
The countdown is on. Everything you need to get the edge at the end of the market day.
Big tech earnings kick off later this afternoon.
Gilead is coming out right now.
We have take two numbers.
Back to the markets, right? Our bread and butter.
NVIDIA is one of the best stories in the tech space.
That actually matters a whole lot more.
It might shock some of your viewers.
You're watching The Close.
Get ahead of tomorrow's trading with The Close. Weekdays on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Well, U.S. Election Day arrives as Donald Trump and Kamala Harris end one of the most dramatic presidential campaigns in history. With polls showing a deadlock race, it's now down to voters to decide the winner. Traders brace for volatility from a tight election result, but for now, the dollar and U.S. futures are holding steady. Plus, Boeing workers accept the latest pay offer, ending a strike that crippled production for almost 2 months. So we have a very, very busy show ahead. We have a lot of earnings also out of Europe. But first, let's take a look at the European markets map. Now, again, everything's on knife edge. I wouldn't say everything's range bound, but certainly there's a lot more caution out there than there was in the last couple of days. If you look at dollar and U.S. equity futures, which is probably where we're focusing on, so let's go straight to cross-asset. We're seeing a bit of green across the screen when it comes to European equities, but again, it's 0.2% higher, so nothing to write home about. S&P futures also up by a similar amount, euro dollar 108.93. Again, I guess a lot of these, assets are actually holding steady ahead of the start of voting in a very tight race. And so we look at immigration, we look at economy, we look at exactly what it means for some of the trades, the Trump trades that have been unwound in the last 24 hours. Now, Boeing workers have also voted to accept a new labor contract and to end a strike that's crippled plane production for more than 7 weeks. So you can see pre-market Boeing 3% higher. And Palantir has posted record profit, quarterly revenue that beat analyst estimates. The company also raised its forecast for the current period, citing higher demand in the U.S. for its artificial intelligence software, Palantir gaining almost 13%. So for the conversations that matter and the insights you need, let's get started.
Newsmakers and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacroix.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacroix here in London. Now, millions of Americans head to the polls today in the 2024 U.S. election, with surveys showing a deadlocked race nationally and in swing states. Let's get more from Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn. Vonnie, thank you for staying up all night to bring us the very latest. Just how close is this looking?
Well, welcome to Election Day for sure, Francine. Very, very close, neck and neck. You mentioned the millions that will go to the polls. That's on top of 81 million who have already cast their ballots. Now, the latest surveys have been tilting a little more towards Kamala Harris, all within the margin of error, at least for the most part within the margin of error. But for example, we had the Marist poll from PBS showing the Vice President leading Donald Trump by 4 percentage points nationally. And then you had the New York Times Siena poll showing the beating Trump in North Carolina, which of course is a state he won the last 2 elections. And then there was that bombshell Iowa poll that showed Harris on top by 3 points. That was such a shocker though, because Iowa is such a deeply red state. Essentially, it'll all come down to those 93 electoral college votes from those 7 swing states, Francine. We should know the votes of the easier states pretty fast, but if any state is within a margin of 1 percentage point for either candidate, it will go to a recount, and at that point we may even be looking at legal challenges. Certainly Donald Trump was telling his supporters at the latest rally tonight in Michigan that his campaign had basically already won.
Vonnie, thanks so much. Vonnie Quinn, of course, with us for the next half an hour. We'll get back to Vonnie in about 5 minutes to really delve a little deeper into some of the undecided voters. Now, to talk about markets, we're joined by Ludovic Subran. He's chief economist at Allianz and Bloomberg's managing editor for FX and rates in the U.S. and EMEA region, Rachel Evans. Thank you both for joining us. Rachel, I mean, you've just been nonstop because there's so much going on. The election's on a knife edge. So where's the smart money going?
Yeah, I think a lot of money recently has been taken off the table. So I think the smart money is going back into people's pockets, perhaps, because we had really been seeing, in the run-up to the election that people have been putting on this idea of the Trump trade. But as Vonnie was just outlining there, in the last kind of couple of days, we've seen some polling numbers that perhaps suggest that Harris is not quite so far behind Trump and may even be a little bit ahead in some of the states that really matter. So yesterday we saw a really significant rally in treasuries and also a really significant drop in the dollar, the biggest one-day drop for the dollar since August, suggesting that people are just sort of starting to rethink exactly how big they want to go on the certitude that maybe we will have a Trump win. So I think there's a little bit of money being taken off the table, and that's probably the smartest thing to be doing at this stage.
Ludovic, I mean, we keep on hearing about trading floors and having everyone on standby through the night in case something happens. There are 2 swing states that we should get a little bit earlier on, especially North Carolina. I'm told North Carolina is the one to watch. Ludovic, how do you see things going right now? And again, what does it mean for markets in the shorter term, in the next 24 hours?
Well, this is what Rachel says, which is very interesting, is that a lot of people are pricing 50% of a Trump win, which doesn't exist on market. So that's why they didn't go all long dollar, or they didn't go all rallying for the treasuries, right? So what it means is, the next few weeks is going to be all for volatility. I think if Trump wins, there's going to be a bit of a rally, but very quickly there's been a repricing on the bond side, so it's going to be quite problematic. If Kamala Harris wins, then the equity market will have to price this corporate tax increase. So I think what is sure is that right now, whatever markets are pricing in don't exist, which is, a 50% win for each of them. So that means there's going to be a lot of repricing in the coming days, so brace for volatility.
And Rachel, when you look at some of the lessons from the last elections, I mean, this feels different because it's really on a knife edge. But can we learn anything from the past?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that jump out to me. I think number one, sort of expect the unexpected. Coming into 2016, it did seem like Clinton was going to be sort of a runaway, and it was Trump, and the market had to really reprice. So to Ludovic's point, we are going to see volatility because there will be unwinding of positions regardless of who wins. But I think the other thing is that we need to think about the bigger picture. It's not just the presidential election that matters here, and that was something that we really learned in 2020. It really took until kind of the special election in January where we saw the Senate flipping to the Democrats, when we saw yields really take off, because that was a sign that Biden was going to be able to get through some of his spending plans. So there's going to be a lot of focus not only on who actually takes the White House, but also what the split is like in Congress. Do we see kind of a sweep for the GOP, or do we see a divided Congress?
And to that point, Ludovic, I guess one of the main questions is what happens if we have a contested election and actually we have 2-3 weeks of mayhem. What does the market do then?
Well, they will not be happy. So I guess if there is this social unrest, the forward visibility, the confidence factor that happens after elections, we can see it all through the past election rounds where you have really this, confidence level up, forward visibility up. This will not happen. This will be postponed to God knows when. And so that will be bad for risky assets, that's for sure, right? And remember, it's all going to be about trade and fiscal policy. the confidence channel is really just there as a safety net, but people are going to be looking very quickly at what happens on the boom bust, what happens on the Fed, can the Fed continue to cut, or there is an inflation risk, and what happens on the tariffs, and how much imported inflation and how much damage does it make to the global economy. Those two pillars are going to be essential. So volatility will not stop once we have, the sweep or the Congress divided type of answer, and it will not stop when we have Inauguration Day in January. This is going to be up for quite some time, unfortunately.
Rachel, how much volatility actually could we see in this scenario?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think kind of like treasuries in previous election cycles, we've seen 39 basis points moves in a day. So that's a significant start, even when we're kind of like processing and digesting the results. But I think, to Ludovic's point, it's going to be all about how those policies come through. And it's kind of hard to sort of get a gauge on exactly what that's going to look like. But we do all remember kind of, the Trump presidency. There were a lot of kind of intraday swings, particularly around some of, his tweets or his comments on what we now call X. Which would kind of give a sense to the market of where we were heading on a particular different policy. So I think it's going to be really interesting to kind of see sort of how quickly some of these policies actually come to pass. Do they, either side, Harris or Trump, whoever's in power, do they actually kind of stick with what they've been saying in the run-up to win an election, to win a campaign, or do they start to moderate? And a lot is going to hang on whether they do have that kind of united or divided Congress as to what they can get through versus having to kind of moderate their opinions and their positions. And a moderation would probably be more positive for the market because it takes some of the edge off. It means it's just a little bit less extreme on either side.
Yeah, is there anything in emerging markets, Ludovic, that you'd be looking at in the shorter term, or is that a story for 2-3 weeks from now?
No, I think, there's been a lot of appreciation of currencies in the emerging markets, especially emerging Asia. And we know, unfortunately, that the seismic wave from a Trump victory, for example, will be sending, depreciation to the emerging world very strongly. So I think it is something that could unwind very quickly in the next couple of weeks, just because of the inflation trade, just because of the reshoring trade, and also just because of, America first, meaning the other second. And so this is something that has impact on some of these emerging markets, which have, twin deficits or that have had issues being attractive for investors and that need to lower rates because they have fought inflation and need to revive growth. But capital will maybe go back to America. So that could actually be a big story, this reverse currency war, if you will, in the next months, not, year.
Great. Thank you both. Bloomberg's managing editor for FX and rates in the US and EMEA, Rachel Evans, joining us today, and Ludovic Subran, chief economist at Allianz, stays with us for more market analysis. This is Bloomberg.
Asia is at the forefront of some of the world's biggest stories. I'm Sherrian in Tokyo.
And I'm Heidi Stroud-Watts here in Sydney, where the trading day begins. We're here in the center of all the action to get you set up with the numbers, news, and knowledge you need for the day ahead.
The demand is indeed recovering. We've been waiting for this moment.
The opportunity of a century.
Join us on Bloomberg The Asia Trade. Weekdays only on Bloomberg TV. Context changes everything.
Bloomberg loves earnings.
I know it's like your super.
Steve was a teacher. He taught me the value of focus, the importance of simplicity, the fact that making things simple is so much harder than making things complex. For those of us that were fortunate enough to work with him, he was the teacher of a lifetime. My first job was delivering papers. And I was about 12 years old. Everybody was sort of expected to work in my family. And I'd get up at 3 in the morning, pick up the stack of papers and start throwing. And usually come back and take a nap before school. throwing papers helped start my college education. And I was the first person in my family that went to college. I knew that being able to do that was a privilege that I needed not to waste. Everyone saw college in those days, and hopefully today, as opening many doors and being able to stand on the shoulders of your parents, that education would do that.
The presidential campaign. Let's get more from Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn. Vonnie, we saw a number of celebrity endorsements on either side. We saw the rallies last night. What's happening today, and what will move the needle for the undecided voters?
Well, people are voting today, Francine, that's for sure, that on top of the 81 million people that have voted early. But yes, we did see a frenetic round of campaigning in battleground states and primarily in Pennsylvania. Both candidates were in Pennsylvania for most of the day yesterday. Donald Trump then went to Michigan, where he has traditionally finished his campaigning, and he campaigned in Grand Rapids. But essentially what they were trying to do is, if there are any undecided voters left, in the 2 hours between now and when most of the polls open on the East Coast, they were trying to push their message across once again, and also to those low propensity voters, as they're called, the voter that just sometimes votes. So for Harris's part, she stuck to her message on reproductive rights, on the economy. Trump stuck to things like immigration, also the economy, but there were very different tones. So Harris stayed very positive, never once mentioning her opponent. Trump, for his part, went quite negative and actually suggested that the election is already won, and if he doesn't win it, then something fishy must be going on.
So, Vonnie, when can we actually expect a result? Because we could have early indications, but then it could be, if it's very tight race, it could be in the balance for quite some time.
And oh boy, is it tight. We saw the latest round of polling, Francine, which had both candidates neck and neck, within the margin of error in all but one poll. I believe it was the Maris PBS poll, which had the vice president beating the president by 4 percentage points. But as for the rest of them, they were neck and neck, 48-48 in Pennsylvania, according to the New York Times Siena poll. So yes, we should expect some of the safer states pretty immediately, so within hours of polls closing, right? But the ones that are more contested, the battleground states, they could take anywhere for, from a few days to a few months. So last time round, it took until the Saturday after the election to get some clarity. This time round, we'll see. It depends on how many states come within 1 percentage point either way for each candidate. That triggers an automatic recount, and after that there can be legal challenges. And as we heard from Trump's rhetoric today, we could expect some of those if Kamala Harris were to win some states that he feels he should have won.
Vonnie, thank you so much. Vonnie Quinn there on the U.S. elections from New York. Now let's get back to Ludovic Soubrand, chief economist at Allianz. So Ludovic, away from the U.S. elections, there's also the Fed. What do they do after, there's been so much speculation on how further they will cut. That's been pulled right back.
Look, we expect the Fed to deliver one cut in 2 days. It's not a hangover cut from the election. It's just that the economy is actually in a good shape for further cuts. We expect the Fed to get another time at the end of the year. So it's going to be 150 basis points, so a total of 100, which is good. It's going to be less restrictive. But, two things. The first thing is you see this very interesting, the Fed cuts, but the long-term yields are still on the rise because it's such a different cycle this time. And the second thing is, the big question everybody has is how much the Fed can cut in 25. And I think this is really the question. The cut of the day after the election doesn't really matter. The big question is, can the Fed deliver 4 or 5 cuts in 25? Or is there this fear of inflation reloaded that could actually stop the Fed halfway through its loosening cycle, which will send seismic shockwaves into the U.S. economy, but also abroad?
Ludovic, is there a material difference on what the Fed does depending on who's president, or the composition also of the House?
In a major one, they have so different fiscal policy, so different trade policies, so different immigration policies, and so different, I would say, safety distance to the independence of the Fed. President Trump actually called for a devaluation of the dollar. Imagine the type of additional inflation you could get into the U.S. economy under the different policy tools that President Trump would like to enact, right? We're talking about 1 to 1.5 points. Of course, that would mean the Fed will have to stop at 4% terminal rate instead of going to 3%. So that's a huge difference for the financing conditions of the U.S.
Ludovic, when you look at elsewhere, some of the central bank action, we had a big budget that wasn't taken all too well here in the UK. Does it change trajectory for the Bank of England?
I do think the Bank of England is the one that has the stickiest, loosening path by far. The budget is yet another example that, it can actually take its time compared to other central banks. The US election could actually be having effect on the real rate differential and on the currencies. We know that central banks on my side of the pond are not obsessed by currencies till the moment it really hits home, especially when, the euro was at parity with the dollar and so forth. So for the Bank of England, as for the ECB, I think the room to breathe will be higher under Harris' presidency because the Fed will have a much more, normal loosening cycle. Does it mean that they will have to stop halfway? I don't think so, because the economies warrant a form of loosening cycle. Just look at the inflation in the UK or in Europe. But it will certainly be having effects on the currency and also on the credit spreads, especially for corporates.
So what does it mean, for example, for the Eurozone at a time where we could see also extra tariffs and a pull out of NATO from the US?
Look, the Eurozone, we expect the ECB to be able to deliver 5 cuts next year. So we go to a terminal rate of 2 or 2.25. They will continue with that path because of the very low growth momentum of Europe. But if there is a dollar liquidity drought because of the US being stuck at 4, you can imagine that the financing in dollar for corporates in Europe is going to be under duress. You can also expect the euro to depreciate by another 5 to 10% of the dollar. And you can certainly expect that the yields, the spreads on the periphery assets, I'm talking Italy here, France, Spain, will be actually reacting very negatively to the news of the US, just because the financing conditions will be different and the trade conditions will be different.
Ludovic, as always, thank you so much for joining us. Ludovic Subran, their chief economist at Allianz. Now, coming up, Boeing already seeing the benefits of ending the crippling strike by its workers with its stock up pre-market trading. We'll get the latest on the deal and what it means for the plane maker next. This is Bloomberg.
It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ, Monday on Bloomberg. Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
With a surge in Bitcoin, you have crypto stocks also surging.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people.
This is a political attack, and we must hold our elected officials accountable.
The transactions.
Really a record-breaking moment.
Bitcoin is the exit strategy.
And the technology.
Awareness is going to grow, and these things grow the overall industry.
Crypto as an asset class is here to stay.
Bloomberg Crypto, only on Bloomberg.
Key investors, top executives, global innovators. Join me for in-depth conversations with the biggest newsmakers on the day's top stories. Insight with Haslinda Onim, only on Bloomberg.
David Weston. Join me for the next generation of Wall Street Week, telling stories of capitalism from business, markets, economics, tech, and climate. Each week, we'll go on the road for a look at what lies behind the headlines of today and what will likely be the headlines tomorrow.
Above all else, it's a mission.
It's done nothing but grow immensely. To me, that's an extraordinary sign.
We can be the change that we want to see.
Watch the all-new Wall Street Week, More than what you need to know, it's what you need to think about.
Bloomberg Surveillance covers the latest in global markets and the political events that influence your world. Join Jonathan Farrell, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Well, Boeing's stock is higher in pre-market trading this morning. Investors welcoming the plane maker's deal with workers who have accepted a pay offer and ended their strike. Now, for more, let's bring in Bloomberg's global aviation editorial lead, Benedict Camel. Benny, to run us through the details of the vote, how was it received?
So it was a bit of a mixed reception back in Seattle late in the evening. The vote result is 59% in favor. Now, that's all they needed. They needed 50%, but 59 is not the most glowing endorsement that you need if you really want to get the workers back in your, in your good books. So there's a lot of work left to do here in terms of sort of repairing the relationship. If you think that, 40%, give or take, still oppose this, there's a lot of pent-up anger. People on the shop floor feel that they were shortchanged in the last couple of years, that they've not been given what they deserved. The pensions, those were one very contentious element that they didn't get back, even with this latest deal. So while this is a victory and it's a good sign, and you can see it in the stock, there's a lot of work ahead for the company.
So, Benny, how long will it be before work resumes, and how can the relationship actually be rebuilt?
So Kelly Ortberg, who's the relatively new CEO at Boeing, he's got his work cut out for himself. He needs to fix the company both sort of culturally, but also in terms of the production line, which has really come to a standstill. That's something you need to remember. This is one of the preeminent manufacturers in the US, essentially producing no planes, or very, very few planes at the moment. And Kelly Ortberg, he did say a couple of weeks ago, it's much easier to sort of turn the switch off than to turn it back on. And that's something he'll find out in the next couple of weeks. He needs to sort of get the production line back up again. People need to come back. Some of them need to be recertified. And we're talking about months rather than days or weeks for really production to come back up. And you can see it in the financials. The company has said that they will keep losing cash this year, and that next year, the first half, will also be a cash outflow. So it's really looking into the latter part of next year when we will probably see a more repaired and refreshed Boeing.
Benny, thank you so much. Benedict Camel, they're in charge of global aviation. Now, coming up, the world braces for the results of a tight and consequential U.S. election. We'll dive into the competing views from the two candidates on the United States' role around the globe. That's next, and this is Bloomberg.
Every single thing I've done it's almost as if somebody has said it can't be done. I mean, I remember I was in a factory and I said, I want to go in the night shift. And they said, no, we don't put women in the night shift. I said, how will I be a successful production manager or personal manager of a factory if I never went into a night shift and knew how a third of my people worked? So in some ways it has fueled some of my determination. It's fueled some of my, okay, I'm going to show this is possible, a sense of, I'm going to go get on and do it. It also gives me courage because I feel sometimes I'm not just doing it for me, I'm doing it for everyone else who comes after me. And I always tell women who ask me for advice saying, put your hand up for the most difficult job. Put your hand up for things that are challenging. You know, go in there and lean into things that are difficult, that are challenging, because that's what gives you the greatest credibility, respect, reputation.
From our studios in New York and San Francisco, our expert hosts have the data and analysis about the companies you know and the startups to watch, plus the interviews you don't want to miss. Watch Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow on Bloomberg Technology, the only daily business show dedicated to tech, right in the middle of the trading action, every weekday, only on Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything. Bloomberg covers the world with unmatched reach and resources. From more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, context changes everything. U.S. jobs numbers are released. Bloomberg has the report under surveillance with crucial data and expert analysis at terminal speed. Nobody covers jobs day like Bloomberg.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. These are your top stories. U.S. Election Day arrives as Donald Trump and Kamala Harris end one of the most dramatic presidential campaigns in history. With polls showing a deadlocked race, it's now down to voters to decide the winner. Well, traders brace for volatility from a tight election result, but for now the dollar and U.S. futures hold steady, plus Boeing workers accept the latest pay offer, ending a strike that's crippled production for almost 2 months. So the world is watching the U.S. today with a very tight race between two candidates with very different ideas of what role the United States should play overseas. Now, for analysis, we're joined by Ross Matheson, Bloomberg's EMEA News Director, and Bloomberg senior writer Stephanie Baker. So thank you both for joining us. Ross, first of all, it's so tight. I mean, the election is so tight. And I know we talk about undecided voters. Have we ever actually seen such a tight race? Are the polls more correct than they have been in the past, or it's just the way that U.S. politics is being played out now?
Well, that is the question about polls, because polls often come into question about how their accuracy, even now, and do you reach the kind of voters who will tell you what they actually intend to do? And is there kind of a mentality where the polls, in a way, all start to repeat each other, and there's a tendency to see those things in polls even if they're not there? So it's very hard to tell, because what is in the mind of the US voter right now, including those who've already voted, but particularly those will be interesting to see in that undecided category who perhaps have voted Republican all their life, but maybe deciding to vote Democrat but don't want to tell anybody. What about those who've been voting Democrat all their lives and now have decided to vote Republican but also don't necessarily want to tell anybody? So a lot of mystery around what's in the minds of those voters, particularly again in those swing states as we come into Election Day today. So the polling does indicate it's absolutely deadlocked, and we know it will come down particularly to those 7 states, those 7 swing states, and how voters decide in a minute.
In terms, first of all, when we find out, there are 2 key states. I think North Carolina it seems to be the one to watch out for, the earlier one to watch out for, because they start counting straight away and polls close at 7. Will that be a good indicator?
Yeah, I mean, there was some question marks over North Carolina, given the amount of time that both Trump and Harris were spending in that state, that indicated that they thought that one was up for grabs. But yeah, they're expected to be one of the earliest states to report. Polls close at 7. I think the bigger story here is that Harris seems to have momentum going into this. She had some of her best polling from battleground states in the last week or so. And there was a Marist poll for NPR last night that showed her up nationally by 4 points, so outside the margin of error. So she's certainly going into this election with momentum. Whether she can carry the day in the battleground states remains to be seen.
What have you found the most surprising thing in all of this, Roz? I mean, there's, it's women issues and women rights. There's also, the Black Caucus that was behind Kamala Harris, but there's a certain demographics that actually is also voting Trump that, intuitively should have maybe voted for Kamala Harris.
Well, that's the thing. As, demographics change, as economic circumstances change, so do voting behaviours change. The narratives that, a certain Democrat, a working-class white voter will vote for a certain party, for example, or educated voters or women voters will gravitate towards one party or one leader. That seems to be changing, and it's becoming less clear. It does seem as though Kamala Harris has done some work to try and harness the female vote and to take those female Republican voters away from Donald Trump, for example, and to also retain that black vote, because we can see some evidence that younger black voters, male voters, are gravitating towards the Republican Party. So all those kind of established lines seem to be moving and shifting, and that's because politics itself is increasingly driven by personality and less by policy. So people are gravitating towards the person at the top and the personality, in the sense, will Donald Trump be better for me, for the economy, regardless of what he says about, issues around gay rights or women or whatnot. Same for the Democrats. And so you're seeing all those things splintering. It makes it harder as a candidate to capture a group as a whole.
But Stephanie, unless there's a big win from someone, and it looks very unlikely, this election is going to be contested. What does that look like?
Right. I mean, you see Trump preparing the ground for contesting the election. He's done that by, contesting various lawsuits in Pennsylvania over voter registrations. There's been a sea of disinformation put out there. And I think there's really no doubt that Trump could try to claim that he's won today before we really know whether all the votes have been counted and what the outcome is. And that could drag this process out unless there is a huge margin for Harris and that she wins this decisively. If there's it comes down to Pennsylvania, where the race looks really tight, and it comes down to just a few thousand voters, this could drag out for quite a while and could be very contested.
Roz, I mean, what's most perplexing for economists is that the economy is firing on all cylinders. And if this election is contested on the economy, then actually the Democrats should be doing quite well, and they don't seem to be punching through in that.
But that's always the challenge between what an economy is actually doing and the people's perception of what the economy is doing. You see that in inflation expectations particularly. It can often be quite a gap between where inflation actually is and where people perceive it to be. And the challenge for politicians is to narrow that gap. And so maybe the Democrats have struggled to sell the message about just how good the economy might be for individuals and where inflation is. That's a positive message is harder to sell sometimes. It's easier, for your opponents to come with a negative message. This is why you feel this way. It's because your wages are not rising, your jobs are not secure. It's much easier to gravitate towards a negative message than a positive one. And also the reality is that Kamala Harris has been a bit careful about laying out specific markers on policy. She has announced some things that she would do around taxes for tipping, for example, to abolish that, for minimum wage and so on. But she's been a bit careful, a bit opaque about her policies, and that makes, again, perhaps she doesn't want to, leave herself open to attack before the election. She doesn't want to be beholden to promises after the election. But it also means that it comes across potentially as a bit woolly sometimes. And again, if you've been associated with the party in power, you're defending your record more often than talking about what you would do next.
Stephanie, if you look at internationally, so you could argue that there are 5 things that could change significantly depending on who's in office. It's Mexico with immigration, NATO in Europe, Ukraine, Middle East, and then China. I mean, you've just written a book also about Putin and how he's, changed his economy to go to war with Ukraine and in certain parts of the West. How does Trump in the White House change anything with Trump?
You're right. The stakes for this election for countries like Russia, Ukraine, China, the Middle East, Mexico are just enormous because of the stark differences between Trump and Harris on foreign policy. You see that Putin and Russia intelligence agencies in the United States have recently accused them just yesterday of fomenting disinformation, spreading fake manufactured videos and fake articles designed to undermine faith in the electoral process. And they warned that they would continue to do that and that this risked violence in the United States. I think that Russia wants chaos in the United States. That's, the intelligence agencies have said that they favor Trump, and I think that is true. But I think what Putin really wants is to have the whole process in total chaos for months, and that would undermine, in particular, U.S. support for Ukraine. He is hoping for a Trump presidency because he believes that Trump will not continue to support Ukraine on the level that the Biden administration has. Harris has made it very clear her strong support for Ukraine and that she would continue to give aid for as long as it takes. So I think that the stakes are incredibly high.
What can you tell us about the 10,000 North Korean troops also at the border? So this is basically they were enrolled by Russia.
I mean, it's kind of shocking that we have not grasped the significance of this in a greater way. North Korean troops on European soil fighting, and the response so far has been almost nothing. That North Korean troops, the reports were that last night they are engaging, that Ukraine had fired on North Korean troops in Kursk, this region of Russia where Ukrainian forces had mounted an incursion and occupy roughly 600 square kilometers. So you now have Ukrainian troops engaging with North Korean troops on European soil, and there hasn't been a stronger response. I expect that this is going to continue to play out and develop as time goes on.
Yeah, and I wonder whether there's kind of, because of this power vacuum, potentially over the next couple of months, we're going to see, stranger things happen. Do we have a clear indication of, Trump in the White House, Harris in the White House, what that means for the Middle East and Israel?
Well, obviously there are several big conflicts going on. Stephanie was talking about the conflict in Ukraine. There are obviously key questions about what this might mean for Asia with China as well, because China does have a vacuum. And if there is a disputed election that goes on, they will maybe try and take advantage of that. But also in the Middle East, if the US is distracted, domestically for an extended period, in the run-up to next year, what does that mean for the conflicts inside Gaza and obviously, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon that's also going on at the moment, and the threat of a broader conflict with Iran? What we do know is that Kamala Harris has largely echoed Joe Biden on the Middle East. She's been a bit tougher on the humanitarian situation inside Gaza, but equally she might struggle to have any great leverage over Benjamin Netanyahu. He seems to decide what he wants to decide, whereas Donald Trump would favour, he has that personal relationship with Netanyahu, and he can talk to him, and he would be convinced, no doubt, he could probably end those conflicts quickly. I mean, he hasn't said that he doesn't support Israel, but equally he says that Israel needs to speed up, in his words, and get things done in its goals against Hamas and Hezbollah in the region. So he certainly would continue to support Israel, but perhaps he'd lean on him also to end things fairly quickly.
Okay, thank you both. I could speak to you for another 3 hours, but we do have other news. Roz Matheson, Bloomberg's EMEA News Director, and Stephanie Baker, Bloomberg Senior Writer. Coming up, we'll look at the countries most exposed to Donald Trump win and increased tariffs. We're joined by George Saravelos, Head of FX Research at Deutsche Bank. That's next, and this is Bloomberg.
Jumpstart your trading day on Bloomberg Open Interest.
2 hours of single stock stories that are driving the opening bell action. We'll take you to Wall Street, Main Street, the C-suite, and beyond.
These are companies that are growing their market.
The great companies in the U.S. are the companies hitting the cutting edge. That's a different story.
Get the inside track on what's buzzing in markets.
With the players who are shaping the narrative.
If you have bad earnings reports, you're going to get punished.
They're not buying what the industry is selling. Join us on Bloomberg Open Interest every trading day, only on Bloomberg.
Bringing you up-to-the-minute financial news whenever and wherever it happens. I'm Michael McKee at the Federal Reserve, and this is Bloomberg.
Always on the heartbeat of the tech
spread across global markets.
The real-time data aspect is going to be important.
We're going to bring you expert analysis on that. Sure.
Don't miss Bloomberg's interview with the
From the beating heart of global finance, economics, and politics, and wherever newsmakers are moving markets, Bloomberg brings you conversations that allow for deep discussions and important insights. What do you think the future is for inflation? Is this new normal? Are markets too optimistic? How do you worry about the things that are outside your control? How does the current fighting completely stop? I'm Francine Lacroix, and this is The Pulse, every weekday only on Bloomberg. Well, the prospect of Donald Trump returning to the White House and the risk of tariffs and inflationary pressure is playing out across the currency markets. There's been some unwinding of the so-called Trump trade. Investors now waiting for the election outcome with polling on a knife edge. Well, it's discussed with George Salavelos, head of FX research at Deutsche Bank. George, I'm so happy to speak to you on such a big day. Which way do you think the markets will go ahead of tomorrow, the big day? Are you staffing all night?
Well, there's a big buzz on the trading floor, Francine. Good morning here. Obviously, it's a huge day. I think it is an exciting day if you're in the market. And we're just looking forward to seeing the results and interpreting the results. I think it's very likely we will see large moves either way, especially given some of the price adjustments we've seen over the last couple of days.
So when you look at dollar strength, George, is it that? I understand there's an intuition there's a Trump trade, but actually we don't really know what happens in terms of policy, in terms of tariffs, or do we?
So I think the most useful way of looking at it is looking at market pricing and what's priced in. From our perspective, I think it's very likely you see a symmetric market reaction over the next 24 to 48 hours. For example, in the euro, we think it's probably going to be around 2% up or down. But I think if you're looking ahead to 3 months, when we look at what the market's pricing in, we actually don't see very much in terms of the so-called Trump trade. So to give you a couple of examples, if you look at the inflation break-even market, so what is the market expecting in terms of inflation? If the market was expecting tariffs, you should be seeing an inflation hump in so-called out inflation years. So out 1 to 2 years, the market would be expecting higher inflation, and the market's not pricing that in. Another example is if I look at ECB pricing, where the terminal rate that's priced is around 2%, in the event of a Trump victory and an aggressive trade war, we could see ECB rates closer to 1%. So while I think the narrative is very much around a Trump trade, and you're likely to see big reactions either way, from a longer-term perspective, the bigger reaction from our perspective is definitely going to be in a Trump victory.
George, what about the twin deficit? Again, there's probably going to be a lot more fiscal policy expansionary on both sides. We have huge debt levels. Who's going to be more of a worry for markets?
So it's interesting you raised fiscal policy. You started the show saying, having this headline that the dollar is a cleaner trade. And I would tend to agree with that because the dollar will likely be impacted by tariffs a lot more compared to fixed income. In fixed income markets, it's all around fiscal policy. And there's going to be a tremendous degree of uncertainty there, especially if we have divided government. The twin deficit is, of course, a big focus for market. It's been a focus for France in recent months. In the US, the way we look at it, between the two deficits, the fiscal deficit and the current account deficit, what dominates in terms of risks, and you can see that in academic evidence and empirical evidence, is the current account deficit, because that's telling you how reliant are you on foreigners buying your debt. And if you look at the US, there's something quite unusual. You've got a very large fiscal deficit, but the current account deficit is relatively well contained. It hasn't increased. So we tend to worry less about this issue, I would say, compared to a few other commentators, because largely the US has been self-financing. A lot of the big increases in deficits in recent years has come from US residents rather than foreign residents.
So, George, given all these complexities, is there a call that, for example, Mexico will have huge concerns depending on who's in the White House? Is there a currency play on the back of that?
So we spent a lot of time looking at the numbers, and what you really need to do is look at many dimensions. You need to model how high you expect tariffs to be. Then you need to look at how big the terms of trade impact will be. So that's how much, what's the share of trade with the US of any specific country? And then you need to look at how important is trade as a whole for a country's GDP. When you look at all these multiple dimensions, there's really two countries that stand out. In emerging markets, it is Mexico, as you mentioned, and we would expect large moves, again, either way, given the focus on trade. And in the developed markets, it's the Eurozone and specifically Germany, which has a very open economy. So those are the two where we'd expect the biggest reactions and follow through in terms of, in the event of a Trump victory.
And again, George, I mean, it's very unlikely that we have a clear winner by tomorrow morning. There's also looking at the composition of the houses and how that changes policy and actually how much power the president has. So how long does the smart money wait for to make the right call?
So I think the point you raise around fiscal is very important, especially for the rates market. And as you say there, it really will matter if we have unified or divided government. I'd like to make a point on two other events that are very relevant over coming weeks, which the market is paying less attention to. One is the China announcements we're expecting, and these also relate to fiscal policy. This is most likely going to be on Wednesday, on Thursday. And it's going to be very relevant for China, very relevant for emerging markets. And then secondly is developments in Germany, where there's worries about potentially a breakup in the coalition, which then could lead the market to reassess policy there as well. So a critical 2 weeks. I would say the FX market is likely the first one to respond in terms of movement because it's less reliant on fiscal policy in terms of the impact, much more reliant on what the executive arm does, where there will be control of trade policy. But for the rest, we might have to wait, as you say.
So interesting. George, thank you for joining us today. George Saravelis, there, head of FX research at Deutsche Bank. Now, coming up, we take a look at how the U.S. election has split opinion in Europe. That's next, and this is Bloomberg.
Is on. Everything you need to get the edge at the end of the market day.
Big tech earnings kick off later this afternoon.
Gilead is coming out right now.
We have take two numbers. Back to the markets, right? Our bread and butter.
NVIDIA is one of the best stories in the tech space.
That actually matters a whole lot more.
It might shock some of your viewers.
You're watching The Close.
Get ahead of tomorrow's trading with The Close. Weekdays on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
Welcome back to the opening trade.
This is Bloomberg Technology.
This is the Asia Trade.
You're watching the close.
Welcome to Balance of Power.
This is Bloomberg.
Asia is at the forefront of some of the world's biggest stories. I'm Sherrian in Tokyo.
And I'm Heidi Stroud-Watts here in Sydney, where the trading day begins. We're here in the center of all the action to get you set up with the numbers, news, and knowledge you need for the day ahead.
The demand is indeed recovering. We've been waiting for this moment.
The opportunity of a century.
Join us on Bloomberg The Asia Trade. Weekdays only on Bloomberg TV. Context changes everything.
Get your fixed income fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield every Friday right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Well, as market liquidity evaporates ahead of the biggest risk event of the year, let's bring in Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel. So, Val, good morning. What are the best and worst case scenarios across assets with this U.S. election?
Yeah, we read all the research reports, so you don't have to. Here's a bit of a glimpse of the consensus out there when it comes to what's the best outcome per asset class. When it comes to the best case for equities, it's a clear winner where you see implied volatility across asset classes plummeting, and that's the best upside for elements like the S&P 500. When it comes to treasuries, the best case for a big rally in treasuries is a Harris win in a split Congress where she has her hands tied on how much spending she could put through. For the dollar, it is a Trump win and a Republican sweep. That is where we worry the most about tariffs and fiscal spending giving the dollar a boost. Let's flip on and talk about the worst case scenario when it comes to these same assets. For equities, it's a contested result. We wake up tomorrow, it's still not a clear picture. We worry about the legal ramifications of lawsuits put forward. For treasuries, it's a Trump win and a GOP sweep in Congress. That is the biggest upside when it comes to treasury yields out there. And then for the dollar, it would be a Harris win and a split Congress. Back to you, Francine.
Valerie, thanks so much, Valerie Teitel there. Now, the outcome of the U.S. election will, of course, have a major impact globally, from Ukraine to the Middle East to world trade. Let's take a closer look at Europe's view with Bloomberg's Oliver Crook in Berlin. So, Ollie, we have great charts, we have great analysis. Who would the world vote for?
Yeah, that's right, Francine. You know the old adage, it's our currency, your problem, in reference to the dollar. It's sort of like that with the U.S. election. So there was a poll that was taken across the sort of world, all the different nations, and they asked the citizens of all these nations, who would you vote for if you could vote in the United States? And overwhelmingly, what we saw from the total is that they are in favor of Kamala Harris by a very large margin. You can see it there at the sort of at the far end there. The largest spread, though, the most sort of pro-Kamala would have be the Latin America, where the spread is about 56 points. Western Europe is not too far behind that, about 53 points, 69% of people saying they would vote for Kamala Harris, only 16 saying that they would vote for Donald Trump. In Eastern Europe and the Middle East, here you see that spread really, really narrow, only a 5-point difference for Kamala Harris in favor of her versus Donald Trump in Eastern Europe, and the same thing in the Arab world in the Middle East, where that spread dwindles down to about 4%. If you look at the question of global stability, because this is the question that affects everybody, when asked who would the world be more stable with Kamala Harris, 32% said yes, 19% said yes under Donald Trump. However, the question was, will the world be more unstable under Kamala Harris? Only 17% said yes, while 74% of respondents across the world said Donald Trump would make the world less stable.
Ollie, thanks so much. Oliver Crook there with the very latest on the U.S. election. Just one corporate story we need to tell you about. Schroders, that share price is tumbling quite significantly, the most in more than 4 years after the firm reported some $2.3 billion of quarterly outflow and warned of £10 billion more of outflows to come. Up next, Bloomberg Brief, Danny Berger and Manus Cranny in New York. We have full election coverage throughout the day. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
will show you how to get the best funding for your startup idea. Let's get started. Here's the deal. If you have an amazing startup idea and need funds to fuel it, we're here to help. Simply send us a video where you explain your idea. Make it clear, concise, and compelling. Hook us in with your passion and vision. Don't forget to include your contact details so investors can reach out directly. This is your chance to shine and get your idea in front of people who can make it a reality. Imagine turning your startup dream into a thriving business. It all starts with that one simple step. So what are you waiting for? Grab your phone, hit record, and let your idea fly. The future of your startup could be just one video away. Remember, be clear, be passionate, and most importantly, be you. We can't wait to see what you've got. Let's get funded now.
Not only feeding, which is the core thing that most households where most of the dollars go against the pet, but treating, and then you start to branch out to things like vitamins and minerals and supplements.
People really love their pets. They want to take care of their pets like they do their family, and it really is a global phenomenon. That's why we recently entered the China market with Blue Buffalo. That's why we bought Edgar & Cooper recently in Europe, because we see the same kinds of trends that have played out here in the U.S. playing out all over the world.
It's the world's second largest economy with a growing influence in global affairs.
My question is, who are your most trusted advisors today? Is it Ted and Todd? Is it Greg and Ajit? Is it your wife, your children? And what do you value about them? Thank you.
Well, it depends whether they're advising me on money or on other things. I trust my children and my wife totally, but that doesn't mean I ask them what stocks to buy. I was, in terms of managing money, there wasn't anybody better in the world to talk to for many, many decades than Charlie. And that doesn't mean I didn't talk to other people. But if I didn't think I could do it myself, I wouldn't have done it. I mean, to some extent, I talk to myself on investments. I think my children have gotten a whole lot wiser over the years. And so I listen to them on a lot of things. I'll listen to my daughter on who to vote for locally because she knows a lot more about that than I do. And I'll listen to my wife on a lot of things, and I won't get into details. So it is important. I mean, you don't live a life where you surround yourself and limit yourself to people you trust. It won't be much fun. I mean, I literally have been in the position ever since I was in my 20s of being able to have people I trusted around me, and I've made mistakes occasionally, but they filter out over time. You learn, and when I found Charlie, for example, in all kinds of matters, not just investment, I knew I'd have somebody that well, I'll put it this way. You can think about this. Charlie, in all the years we worked together, not only never once lied to me, ever, but he didn't even shape things so that he told half lies or quarter lies to sort of stack the deck in the direction he wanted to go. He was.
Or is it Bull Flatteners on a Harris victory? And it could tell us whether we're concerned about inflation or the deficit or something else. I do think the auction is going to be interesting today. Ooh. And we have a 30-year auction tomorrow, too. If you got real fiscal concerns, are you going to see the creeping in of a bond buying base that's no longer willing to support America, fiscal deficits are going to balloon.
And this comes to the very essence of it. The fiscal deficit under Trump, again, we've hammered these numbers home, 7.75 trillion. Under Harris, it's just over 3.7. I just said to Danny, I got through a brat summer. We've gone through a dumpster truck. We've seen many McDonald's fries. What else can we get through?
Did brat summer prepare you for today?
Brat summer overwhelmed me. Overwhelmed me.
We're so far from the summer, man.
We're so far from the summer, but we are counting down. These polls are going to open. Election day, it's here. Donald Trump finished his campaign late last night in Michigan. Kamala Harris staged her last stand on the famous steps from Rocky in Philadelphia.
My message to Americans tonight is simple. We do not have to live this way. We do not have to settle for weakness, incompetence, decline, and decay. We can fix every single problem our country faces and lead America, and indeed the whole world, to new heights of glory.
Look, the race is not over, and we must finish strong. So listen, here's the thing about the hard work. We like hard work. Hard work is good work. Hard work is joyful work. And make no mistake, we will win.
For the latest on the candidates and the final pitches, Bloomberg's Mike Shepard joins us now from Washington. Mike, if I look at Donald Trump, he finished the campaign in Battle Creek. Kamala Harris, she staged her last stand in Philadelphia. But they were two very, very different narratives that came through. If you listen to Harris, it was calling for a fresh start. It was very measured and very focused. Again, listening to some of Trump's pitches yesterday, he went from safer, stronger country to a depression to calling out Nancy Pelosi. So there were two very different styles going to the close.
Absolutely, and it was a reflection, Manus, and I'm glad you noticed this because you see their approaches to this race summed up in one set of speeches one evening. Donald Trump leaning into his familiar messages on the economy, where he's accused the Biden administration of widespread failures, and on immigration, too, where he said that the president and vice president have let the nation down in terms of enforcing the border. Likewise, Kamala Harris has tried to pitch herself with a forward-looking vision. And interestingly, in her last 36 hours of appearances, she did not even mention her opponent's name once. And that's a striking contrast from the preceding weeks when she tried to paint him as the exact opposite of what the nation needed at this moment. Someone who she called a divider, someone who she said would tear the nation apart. And instead tonight, she really tried to pitch it forward. She was showing a lot of energy, and you could sense on the Trump stage he looked a little worn, a little fatigued, but he was also bringing up something else we'll have to watch out for, and that is his claims about voter fraud that are unsubstantiated, yet sowing doubts about the validity of the results that we'll be seeing over the next hours and days.
Shep, I know this race is a knife's edge, and it's almost impossible to call. I'm going to ask you something else that is nearly impossible to call too, but the schedule today, the kind of procedure we might see. What states might we hear from first? What should we be looking out from as some of these polls start to close?
Well, it's a great question, Danny, because after all this wait, we want the result. We want to see, after this really chaotic and tumultuous campaign, an outcome so we can start moving on and start focusing on. And of course, the markets are very eager to see what will happen next, but it's going to take some time. Among the first states to close will be Georgia and Virginia, and then we'll see North Carolina around 7:30, and then Pennsylvania, Florida, and New Hampshire in a batch about 8 p.m. But some of the key states will be closely contested. The 7 swing states that we've been following all year long. Our surveys at Bloomberg and Morning Consult and other outside polling have all showed them to be very, very tight. Those races will be tough to call for news media outlets in the immediate aftermath once we hit, say, 7 o'clock in Georgia, 7:30 in North Carolina, barring a very wide margin in each of those races. So we'll be buckling in for a while into tonight.
Yeah, buckle up. It's going to be bumpy in rates and FX land. Just very, very briefly, Joe Rogan actually endorsed Donald Trump. This is during a podcast with Elon Musk. I'm looking at his Instagram. That's 19 million people, but the expanse is wide. It's not just Instagram. What can that trickle through to? What's the impact?
Well, I'm glad you asked that because this kind of emerged last night very quickly. Trump announced it from the stage, and we had heard Rogan and Musk talking, but Trump himself announced it from the stage in Pittsburgh. But at this stage of the race, it's unclear what kind of impact it will actually have, simply because half of the country is already voted. We've had 80 million voters already cast ballots. And so by this point, it's unclear whether that will motivate it, any of the remaining Trump supporters who might be out there and not sure if they're motivated enough to go to the polls or change any minds. So it'll be interesting to see if this has any effect, but it is clearly aimed at this demographic Trump has been trying to excite in the final days, and that is male voters that he is concerned might not be turning out enough.
Yeah, it really just emphasizes what might be a historic gender gap in these results. Shep, thank you so much. We know you have a long day ahead of you. Thanks for joining so early. That is Bloomberg's Mike Shepard in Washington. Let's stay on the election. Joining us now is Anna Rosenberg of Amundi Asset Management. Anna, great to speak with you on this, what's likely to be a momentous day. How are you telling clients on how they should be prepared for today?
That's a good question. I think at this point it's wait and see, because the outcomes are, of course, very starkly different for the world and likely for the markets. So at the moment, I think we're just preparing for all possible outcomes, and we are ready to react in whatever way we need to, depending if we have a sweep on any of the sides or a divided government.
Anna, good morning to you. What did you learn from yesterday with the jolt from Iowa? The bond market reacted, the dollar market reacted viciously. What did you learn from that?
Well, I think that there's a lot of uncertainty still here, right? I think that what we saw in the last couple of weeks as Trump was improving in the polls was that the market was starting to show evidence of Trump trades being in there. But I think some of this has unraveled now, and there's a lot more uncertainty. And to me, this is just a preload of what we're likely going to see after the election is officially announced, where we're likely going to see some very stark positive reactions first, in a way, no matter what the outcome is, because the election will be called. We will know what the result is, so the risk will come down. And then I think we're going to see very different reactions, of course, on depending on the outcome. If we see a divided government, if we see a sweep on any of the sides, we're going to see different reactions. So to me, the recent moves are just reflection of the uncertainty out there.
Anna, when we have you on, you're always so wonderful on the geopolitics, putting this stuff into context on a world stage. What is your concern about instability we might have as a result of this American election?
So if we get a Harris victory, I think there's going to be a big sigh of relief, if you will, amongst the U.S. allies, especially in Europe, because it will be considered as a continuity government compared to the Biden administration. That will mean that we're likely not going to see as much effort on the European side to step up defense spending, for example. However, on the other hand, if we have a Trump victory, there's going to be a lot more uncertainty and concerns over the tariffs and over what this could also mean for geopolitics. However, it is too early to kind of expect that a Trump victory is necessarily a negative development for geopolitical stability, because there are some positive upsides that we could see. For example, if we do get a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine under a Trump presidency, this could lower the overall geopolitical risk, because it could force Iran and Russia to separate somewhat, because Russia would come closer to the US again. So here you have an outcome that would be overall considered positive for geopolitical developments, even though Trump is generally considered as a bigger geopolitical threat.
And I think one of the biggest worries over Ukraine, Russia, is what kind of a settlement Trump may indeed cede to Putin. I think that's in the background of everybody's mind. Let's just extract a little bit further. If it is a Trump victory and perhaps even a red sweep, lower corporate tax, you say, will supersede any supply and inflation shock from tariffs. But Anna, that is very dependent on really the reaction function from the rest of the world on any tariffs that Trump may well load onto them.
Oh, absolutely. I think we're going to see very different reactions. Clearly, we have had statement. There's going to be 60% tariffs on everything coming from China, 10% tariffs on pretty much everyone else. Now, these tariffs, if they are implemented, and I think it's quite likely that they will be implemented, because they're going to be fairly easy going to be implemented, no matter how the House and the Senate ultimately looks like. There's going to be a reaction and a retaliation, and those reaction and retaliations from around the world will ultimately shape the extent of those tariffs being implemented. So we shouldn't take them at face value. I think we're going to see a lot of economic friction, a lot of tit for tat, more protectionism on all sides. But all of this of course, is inflationary, right? It adds costs, it adds economic disintegration, and that's not good for global growth.
Indeed, it just depends how universal these tariffs are and how enduring and sticky they become. Anna, thank you very much. Counting down to the election 2024 with Anna Rosenberg at Amundi Asset Management. Other stories trending on your Bloomberg terminal this morning. The $19.5 billion merger between Vodafone and Three may be approved if both agree to invest in a large-scale upgrade of the UK's mobile network. Now, if it's approved, the merger would create the largest UK mobile operator by revenue.
Palantir shares, they are soaring pre-market up 12.6%. Its results beat analyst estimates driven by AI demand. Its net income, that was a record for the company, coming in at $144 million. It also expects U.S. commercial revenue to climb over 50% this year.
Aramco held its quarterly dividend at $31 billion, despite lower profit to support Saudi Arabia's multi-trillion-dollar economic transformation plans. The payout is crucial for the Saudi budget, as crude prices remain far below the levels the kingdom needs to balance its spending.
Coming up, it's a deal. Boeing's union workers accept the latest offer, shares up 2% pre-market. We're going to discuss that next on your Bloomberg Brief.
Jumpstart your trading day on Bloomberg Open Interest.
2 hours of single stock stories that are driving the opening bell action. We'll take you to Wall Street, Main Street, the C-suite, and beyond.
These are companies that are growing their market.
The great companies in the U.S. are the companies hitting the cutting edge. That's a different story.
Get the inside track on what's buzzing in markets with the players who are shaping the narrative.
If you have bad earnings reports, you're going to get punished.
They're not buying what the industry is selling. Join us on Bloomberg Open Interest every trading day, only on Bloomberg.
Good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
Welcome back to the opening trade.
This is Bloomberg Technology.
This is the Asia Trade.
You're watching the close.
Welcome to Balance of Power.
This is Bloomberg. It's the world's second largest economy with a growing influence in global affairs. But geopolitical uncertainties, deflationary pressures, and questions about foreign investment linger. Bloomberg, the China Show, brings you the unmatched expertise you need to keep track of breaking news, in-depth market analysis, and the most influential newsmakers in and around China. Bloomberg, the China Show. Weekdays around the world, right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
They secured a victory. They voted by 59% to accept the agreement, and they get to move forward. The strike will end, and now it's our job to get back to work and start building the airplanes, increase the rates, and bring this company back to financial success.
Boeing Union President John Holden on the deal. Shares of Boeing rising after the workers voted to accept a new labor contract, ending a 53-day strike that crippled production. Benedict Campbell has been tracking the strike throughout. He is with us now. I look at the number, 59% approved. That leaves me 41% that didn't. How strong is this deal? Is this just calm for now, but trouble down the road?
Yeah, that's very much what's sort of waiting for Boeing. 59% is okay. It's what they needed statistically, mathematically, but it would have been good, I guess, sort of for the mood at the company, particularly for management trying to heal relations with the workers, to get a little bit more backing here. We just heard here from John Holden, a slightly weary John Holden, I will say. I think everyone was slightly tired of this. You know, we're more than 50 days into this strike. Everyone wanted to get this over with, and they got it over with, but really the hard hard work starts now. The CEO, Kelly Ortberg, has said that turning the machine off is much easier than turning it back on, and that's something they'll have to do in the next days and weeks, really getting people back to work, getting some of them recertified, getting the planes produced again. You know, they're essentially at zero production at the moment on the crucial 737. There's a lot of work waiting for the company, but for the time being, there's a general sense of relief that that's done. You're seeing it in the stock. But again, you know, to really heal relations, they probably would have liked to have seen a slightly higher result. The vote against was always higher than the vote for. So that gives you a sense of just how divided the workforce still is over this.
Benny, to the point of getting back up and running, we heard from Ryanair yesterday, whose results suffered because they didn't get the deliveries of Boeing planes they were supposed to. Boeing's own customers are having relationships that are fraying because of the inability of Boeing to deliver. As you mentioned, he said that it's harder to get things back up and running, but what does that timeline look like?
Well, we're probably talking months here, and if you look at the Boeing earnings that were unveiled at the end of last month, the company said that the remainder of this year will be cash negative. There'll be a cash outflow, and then that was sort of the shocker for a lot of people, is that the first half of next year will also be cash negative, and that gives you a sense of just how in deep a hole they are at the moment and how long it'll take to get back out of it. So we're really looking at the second part of next year when we might see sort of a repaired Boeing, and that's not just getting production back on track. It also means having a hard look at the portfolio, thinking about what do we want Boeing to look like going forward? What can we afford? What can't we afford? What's a reasonable portfolio that we should be carrying through? So a lot of work waiting for the company. They wanted to make 38 737s a month. That was sort of their goal. And obviously right now they're at zero, so they have to slowly start ramping that up again. At the moment, the company is producing 4 aircraft a month, 4 787s. So that's really not a lot of aircraft coming out of one of the world's biggest manufacturers.
Benny, thank you so much for keeping us on top of this story. Bloomberg's Benedict Campbell. Turning to tech, Apple is making a push into smart glasses. They had an internal study of products codenamed Atlas to set the stage for developing its own, that according to Bloomberg sources. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Tom McKenzie. Tom, there is a graveyard out there littered with past attempts for smart glasses. What is Apple trying to do here?
And I think by that graveyard, you're referencing Google glasses, of course, what, about a decade ago or so. So Meta's come through. They have their own successful partnership with Luxottica. It seems like Apple is now eyeing that potentially as the next piece of hardware. Of course, they scrapped the Apple Car. They've been looking for that new revenue driver when it comes to the hardware piece. Mark Gurman, of course, our reporter covering Apple, reporting that they have started testing internally some of the smart glasses that are on the market. This is a project code named Atlas, and it suggests, given it's driven by one of the engineering divisions, that they are seriously considering developing their own type of smart glasses. Of course, Apple does have its Vision Pro, which you can see on the screen there. Fantastic if you want to watch a movie. It has some office applications as well. But in terms of widespread uptake, the price tag, more than $3,000 plus the fact that it's pretty chunky as a headset, has meant that that hasn't happened in terms of widespread uptake. Meta's Luxottica glasses, they're priced at, what, $299? They have some functionality in terms of being able to speak and ask questions, in terms of your AI assistant, being able to take photos, videos. That may be, it seems, somewhere that Apple is looking to go. And it could be a challenge for Meta. But Meta, of course, is not standing still. Meta came out and previewed about a month ago an AR version, sort of an augmented reality version of their smart glasses. Probably a couple of years away still, but it reminds us that Meta is working hard on this application. Snap as well, previewing an AI version of their smart glasses. Again, probably a couple of years down the line. But if Apple gets into the mix, this could really reshape that sector.
Yeah, well, we've certainly got our very own Bloomberg anchor there, modeling those glasses. Yeah, it's a heck of a gap to close, isn't it, between $3,000 on Oculus down to maybe $300, which is out there from Meta. Tom, thank you very much. Tom McKenzie, tracking the Apple story for us, coming up with Danny and I. Hedge funds having second thoughts. Why some are now betting for a different candidate with Election Day finally here. We'll give you the context right here on Bloomberg Brief.
do you think it'll be the case where someday you will be an investment committee or I'll be an investment committee and we just apply AI, decide whether it's a good deal or not, or we're not going to be there anytime soon?
I don't think we'll be there in the near term. And David, because being on investment committees, there's the analytics of the math, there's the people, and then there's judgment. So analytics of the math, I think AI will help us get way more refined. Right now, we have analysts building models upon models. Our typical investment memo is 86 pages. So we could refine that down very, very seamlessly to pieces. The people aspect to it, to make a judgment call on, do I believe this entrepreneur is going to go the next mile? Do I believe that the background of the entrepreneur, who they are, what they stand for, their values, their family, that's the harder one. I think AI is going to take some time to get there. And then the final piece ends up being judgment. And I don't believe we've seen anything yet that gives us a sense of judgment that we're able to apply.
From the world of politics to the world of business, Joe Matthew and Keely Lines deliver news, insight, and analysis live every trading day. Balance of Power live around the world every weekday, only on Bloomberg.
It's the countdown to the market open as we bring you the first trades across Europe.
We'll debate the most important stories and what will drive the big investment decisions throughout the morning. I'm Guy Johnson.
I'm Kriti Gupta.
And I'm Anna Edwards. Join us every weekday morning for the opening trade, live at 7 a.m. here in London.
Only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Let's get you some front page news, a look at what's making headlines around the world. First up, the Wall Street Journal has this. Russia is suspected of plotting to send incendiary devices on U.S.-bound planes. 2 devices ignited in Europe at DHL logistics hubs. Officials say the aim was to put them on cargo or passenger aircrafts.
Certainly frightening. Washington Post leads with rural Arizona could try to thwart the election certification. 2 Republican county leaders criminally charged after delaying 2022 results. People who live in Arizona worry it was a rehearsal for the presidentials.
And this is one of the most read stories on the Bloomberg.
Yeah.
Hedge funds second-guessing a Trump victory and now betting that the dollar to fall. We saw that trade a lot yesterday. But in general, Manus, volatility has been really, really heightened for these different asset class. 1 week euro-dollar volatility, I think at its highest in over a year at this point.
Yep.
And it's a nice clean read, as George Servelos puts it, over anxiety over this election.
Look, you can disaggregate this in some ways. These FX trades are maybe a little bit more to do with tariffs. How sticky will they be? Euro volatility, Danny, the pricing on euro volatility to hedge yourself, it spiked the most since 2008. But we go back to Mark McCormick's conversation with us. Regardless of who wins, the U.S. exceptionalism is key, and that keeps the dollar bid.
Yeah, it certainly does. But Trump would reset the markets, as he says, towards politics. We have Torsten Slok of Apollo coming up.
To succeed in Wall Street, what skills do you need? Do you need to be somebody who claws people in the back, people that you have to be tough, you have to be fighting people all the time? What are the skills that really take to succeed in Wall Street?
Great question. Of course, you have to work hard. So I can tell you what I found for me, and it's probably counterintuitive. I had to stick out, which is interesting because I made the decision earlier being really the only woman, I already stuck out, and I thought I might as well double down on that. I can't hide. So how did I do that? It was by being a contrarian. And I refused as a research analyst to ever publish research reports that said me too. That said, oh, IBM reported earnings, they came in 2 cents ahead. One of the pennies was currency, the other penny was lower G&A, blah, blah, blah. Forget it. Big calls on big stocks. My very first piece of research I published was very negative at a time nobody did it. I stood the heck out. And when I was right, that elevated me. And David, I've done that as a research analyst, but I did it in business as well. Here's a business strategy. If everything's fine, just keep your head down and execute. Every once in a while, you have a big insight, and you can build an entire business, in fact, an entire industry around it.
Bloomberg covers the world with unmatched reach and resources. From more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, context changes everything. Get your fixed income fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield every Friday right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
From our global headquarters in New York, welcome to Bloomberg Brief. Danny Berger alongside Manus Cranning. Let's set your agenda.
It is election day in America. Futures are higher. The dollar is steady as the polls open. Kamala Harris makes her final pitch in Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania, I'm here to ask for your vote. I am not looking to score political points. I am looking to make progress.
Donald Trump rallies in Michigan to close out the campaign with the race still on a knife's edge.
Vote for me and I will deliver rising wages, soaring income, and a colossal surge of jobs, wealth, and opportunity for Americans.
And Boeing reaches a deal with its union workers, ending a 53-day strike.
The strike will end, and now it's our job to get back to work and start building the airplanes, increase the rates, and bring this company back to financial success.
It's election day in America and a statistical toss-up. Equity showed some nerves yesterday, declines being led by the Mag 7. Steady this morning, though a different story for this bond market. A clear unwind of Trump trades over the last 24 hours with some of those polls in Harris's favor. The 10-year yield, Manus, at one point fell by 12 basis points. It ended with its biggest daily decline since that poor jobs report in August. Yields chart ever so higher this morning, again, tracking some of those betting market odds. It is dollar weakness, though, again this morning. You see a euro on the bottom of your screen stronger. Manus, I think one of the most interesting contours, really of this year, but just underlined by the past few weeks, is that equities have been the staid asset class. You mentioned this. Citi saying that equities are trading more on fundamentals, more on the economy versus the election. Usually you wouldn't say that equity traders are the ones who keep their cool about them.
No, not at all. But then they've got growth and they've got U.S. exceptionalism. They've got a little bit more swag in their bag relative to the volatility that the bond traders have got. They've got a one-year high. They don't quite know who's going to be in charge and what the fiscal program is going to be. And then the other side of the trade for the FX traders, the reason why it's so expensive, it's the biggest spike in volatility hedging since 2008 on the euro dollar, is because they don't know if it is a Trump victory, what scale of tariffs and how sticky will those tariffs be on China and on Europe.
But that's why having a clear result will be so important for risk assets, because if you have a clear result, that FX volatility can come down, and that's the kind of parameters necessary to really ignite a risk asset rally. So we do have Americans heading to the polls today, for those who haven't already early voted, to elect the next president of the United States. Candidates Kamala Harris and Donald Trump made their final pitches in battleground states to close out what has been a tumultuous election season.
My message to Americans tonight is simple. We do not have to live this way. We do not have to settle for weakness, incompetence, decline, and decay. We can fix every single problem our country faces and lead America, and indeed the whole world, to new heights of glory.
Look, the race is not over, and we must finish strong. So listen, here's the thing about the hard work. We like hard work. Hard work is good work. Hard work is joyful work. And make no mistake, we will win.
Bloomberg Government Congress reporter Zach Cohen joins us now from Washington. Zach, this is a race where each candidate and each of the candidate surrogates think that they will win, given how close the polls are at this moment. What kind of final pitches did we get from the candidates yesterday?
Yeah, if this race is on a knife's edge, today we find out actually who made the cut. If this race is really determined by, whether voters believe that the country's on the right track versus the wrong track, the two presidential candidates have been honing their message to really focus on those key constituencies. Donald Trump's message, very apocalyptic, pessimistic about the state of the country, hoping to tap into voters who are concerned about the economy. And Kamala Harris, just a couple of months after taking over the top of the ticket from Joe Biden, offering a more optimistic, hopeful version of the future in hopes of giving Democrats the keys to the White House for another 4 years. And so how voters interpret those messages across the battleground states, 7 swing states that are basically tied at this point in Bloomberg News Morning Consult polling, will determine who gets the keys, not just to the White House, but to Congress as well.
Zach, good morning to you. Just run us through the closes. I mean, these swing states are going to be critical. Just the theater of the closes on how quickly we may well get an indication from some of those swing states. Some will come, we hope, tonight, but others may take a little bit longer.
That's right. We'll start to see the first polls close in the 6 o'clock hour in Indiana, Kentucky, not exactly swing states. Probably expect to see some very early calls there in those heavily Republican states. In the 7 o'clock hour, we'll start to see polls close in places like Florida, Ohio, Virginia, that are traditionally more swing states that have moved toward the respective parties over the years. The Harris campaign expects that results in places like Michigan will start to get some results tonight, but certainly places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania could take a lot longer. Trump, when he was declared the winner in 2016, we knew the results before daybreak the next day, but when Biden unseated Trump in 2020, it took 4 days for the results to get called. I expect something in the middle is likely when we'll see the result this time, given how narrow the race is and the fact that mail-in voting continues to be a popular form of casting ballots across the country, though probably not quite as much as it was during the pandemic.
Zach, what about down ballot races? What about Congress? What battles are you looking at, and when might we have some sort of clear picture with whether it will be a GOP sweep or something divided or something else?
Democrats are defending a really narrow majority in the Senate, Republicans likewise in the House. The most likely scenario is that both of those flip just based on where the states are. You've got Democrats defending some really tough seats in places like Montana, Ohio. West Virginia is certainly a loss for Democrats already. Jim Justice, the Republican governor there, is expected to win that Senate race to replace Joe Manchin, the Democrat turned independent. But in the House, Republicans are defending really tough seats in places like New York and the Hudson Valley, Long Island, as well as in California. And the battle for the House could take days to decide if we're waiting for results in California, which tends to count its votes much more slowly. And so if we're waiting for places like Orange County to count their ballots, we're in for a long couple of days here to figure out whether there is, in fact, a Republican sweep or some form of divided government here in Washington.
Okay, well, we'll be back tomorrow in 24 hours to try and dissect that for our viewers. Zach, thank you very much. Zach Cohen, part of the Bloomberg government team tracking the election. Let's stay on topic. We have Apollo chief economist Torsten Slot. Torsten, clarity is golden. It will help the bond market, the FX market, and to a certain extent, the equity market. Contested is perhaps the worst thesis of all. Now, that's what the market is presuming we're going to get, some kind of potentially contested situation. Do you just expect overall volatility to trend higher in the next couple of months because of a lack of clarity, not just necessarily an outcome, but policy risk?
Well, it depends a lot on the outcome. I mean, if we do get gridlock, and if we do get a situation where we do not know who will have the power, of course, both in the executive branch and also in Congress, then we will have a situation where we may have the market beginning to think about, well, what can actually be done during this session. So the only thing that we do know is that both candidates have been scored by the Penn-Wharton budget model and by the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget to increase deficits, both for Harris's plan and for Trump's plan. So the market may begin to focus on, well, how much of an increase in deficits is coming and what type of spending and what type of tax cuts might be coming along.
Well, Torsten, you've noted that the U.S. government's going to have to roll over $9 trillion of debt, about a third of their total, in the next year. Auction sizes will expand by some 30%. What is the threshold where the bottom falls out and the world loses its willingness to finance American debt?
Well, so far, Treasury auctions every week continue to look solid. There's a number of things that we are monitoring that is very important, namely bid-to-cover ratios, meaning what was the amount of bidding relative to what was offered. We're also taking a very close look at how much auctions tailing. We've had some tailing, meaning some auctions where the yield has been coming in at a level that was higher than what the market was trading at in the when-issued bond in the last several months. And all that is also showing up in some signs of weakness when it comes to foreign participation. We've seen foreign buying of treasuries decline in the last few years, and we've at the same time seen domestic buying, in particular by household and by real money, meaning pension insurance. So we've had a replacement of a yield-insensitive buyer, namely foreigners, to a yield-sensitive buyer, namely domestic buyers. And that, combined with the Fed potentially lowering rates, is bringing up some issues about, well, this dynamic of the Federal Reserve lowering the front end of rates. What are investors going to do with their money in money market funds? Are they going to buy duration in treasuries, or might that move to credit? So these different aspects of what is demand for treasuries, Danny, I completely agree. This becomes very important over the next several months.
And it may only be the bond vigilantes that actually bring the fiscal largesse to heel. That seems to be the building theory. You call steeper curves either way. I'm curious to understand the extremity of that, let's say, under a Trump presidency and or a red sweep. Is that something that can get way beyond 4.5 and up into the 5s? What's the extremity that you price on that bull steepener?
Yeah, so one way to quantify that is to look at my Bloomberg screen and look at the term premium. And the term premium has increased in the last 6 weeks about 50 basis points. That's another way of saying that the premium, meaning that the price that investors need in terms of extra yield for buying duration in U.S. government bonds, has gone up in 10-year rates by about 50 basis points. And that's important because that means that it is not only Fed expectations that are driving 10-year rates. It's also now suddenly, at least it looks like, fiscal worries. Another way of saying that is that since September, when the Fed cut rates 50 basis points, we've seen 10-year rates go up by 75 basis points. In other words, it's highly unusual that when the Fed cuts rates, that long rates go up. And that can be two reasons for this. Either the market is saying that the Fed made a mistake, or it could be that the market is saying, well, we do have a fiscal situation under both candidates, and we're now beginning to worry in the market about whether that situation is getting worse. So therefore, Manus, to your question, I think that over the next several months, when we have more clarity about, is this a blue sweep, a red sweep, do we have gridlock, the exact situation and the exact combination becomes very important for what is exactly the outlook for the fiscal position.
Torsten, in this world where you have higher yields, presumably you have a stronger dollar. And you get into this feedback loop where stronger dollar means globally financial conditions tighten, and you have other central banks needing to cut more. And then you get the feedback loop of higher American rates, of stronger U.S. dollar. Is there a potential for that sort of doom loop to take hold in the environment you're describing?
I do think, Danny, that that's a very important point, namely that it is, of course, you can never look at the U.S. in isolation in this discussion. The rest of the world, unfortunately, from a business cycle perspective, has a lot more weakness. Europe is weak for several idiosyncratic reasons. We have, of course, in particular, the challenge with China slowing down, that's slowing exports from Germany. We also have, at the same time, still challenges with the energy transition to come off Russian gas and oil. And combined with China also being weak for demographic reasons, because the housing market is declining, and because of the trade war with the U.S. and with Europe, we do have that the U.S. still looks, at least in relative terms, as long as the business cycle continues to be so strong in the U.S. still looks relatively better. And that is saving the dollar, and that is also likely saving still the significant inflows into U.S. financial markets. But this becomes very important because if the U.S. does have a slowdown, that's not the baseline scenario. But if we do have a slowdown in the U.S., then that could begin to ask some new questions about, well, what would the dollar then do? Because the dollar normally goes down when the U.S. starts to slow down.
Well, I'd say Olaf Scholz and Macron will probably breathe a big sigh of relief if it's not a Trump administration for them. They've got enough problems on their doorstep. Let's just round it off with the Fed. The Fed comes in just a couple of days. You say that they cut in November, but they pass in December. I'm curious to understand the length of pause that maybe begins to get priced in, because we go into a certain amount of policy uncertainty, regardless of who sits in that White House or who wins. There is a period of policy prevarication. So just how long of a pause do you expect, Torsten?
Yeah, so I mean, a very fundamental question, both for S&P 500 and for public markets and for private markets, including private credit, is what happened to long and variable lags? Why is it that when the Fed started raising rates in March of 2022, that the economy has still not slowed down? We just got GDP growth last week for the third quarter, which was 2.8. And we now have Atlanta Fed GDP for fourth quarter saying 2.3. I know it's early, but where is this slowdown that the Fed has worried so much about? So with that backdrop, fundamentals are still chugging along very nicely. Last Friday, the unemployment rate moved sideways, 4.1. Wage inflation actually accelerated from 3.9 to 4.0. So from our perspective, there is no reason for the Fed to cut rates in December. And we think the economic data continues to look just fine. And with the backdrop of potentially, you're right, Manus, we have maybe some uncertainty on the policy front. But if we have still a gridlock situation where there's still a lot of questions being asked about what policies will be implemented, then I think the bottom line remains that the U.S. economy continues to do just fine. And therefore, the Fed does not need to lower interest rates as dramatically as the dot plot is suggesting.
Well, one thing is for certain, it's going to be a strange next few days. Torsten, thank you so much for joining us. Apollo's Torsten Slok there. This is your brief.
Join me for the next generation of Wall Street Week, telling stories of capitalism from business, markets, economics, tech, and climate. Each week, we'll go on the road for a look at what lies behind the headlines of today and what will likely be the headlines tomorrow.
Above all else, it's a mission.
It's done nothing but grow immensely. To me, that's an extraordinary sign.
We can be the change that we want to see.
Watch the all-new Wall Street Week. More than what you need to know, it's what you need to think about.
About artificial intelligence. Is artificial intelligence going to enable you and others to say we have enough information to know exactly what something is going to be worth in terms of insuring it or not?
Artificial intelligence is finding its way into our business in a variety of different factors. I think the first piece is getting much better insight into data, which allows us to make better decisions on underwriting. It's also a great opportunity to service business better in terms of like call centers and different ways of what's using robotics and other AI will be very helpful. But it is an emerging practice within the industry and one that is evolving very quickly. So it's also going to present risks that other companies, how they use it and how they use large language models and making sure the decision making is very sound. So it's complicated, but it definitely is benefiting the business today.
From our studios in New York and San Francisco, our expert hosts have the data and analysis about the companies you know and the startups to watch, plus the interviews you don't want to miss. Watch Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow on Bloomberg Technology, the only daily business show dedicated to tech, right in the middle of the trading action, every weekday, only on Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything.
They secured a victory. They voted by 59% to accept the agreement, and they get to move forward. The strike will end, and now it's our job to get back to work and start building the airplanes, increase the rates, and bring this company back to financial success.
Boeing Union President John Holden there. Boeing is back in business, at least almost. It's reached a deal with its union workers, ending a 53-day strike that crippled production. Shares climbing nearly 2% in the pre-market trade. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Benedict Campbell. Benny, how was this deal done? How many people voted for it? What are the details?
So the details, 59% voted in favor of this. Now, you'd think in a political context, 59% is a landslide, but in this context where you have a company culture that is deeply divided between sort of upstairs and downstairs, workers feeling shortchanged, this is probably not the glowing endorsement that the company had hoped for, and the union indeed, but it is a deal. Mathematically, that ends the strike. They only needed 50%, but there's a lot of work for the company going ahead. They need to repair the relationship, as I said. They need to get the workers back on board. You just heard that from John Holden, the union president, saying we need to get Boeing financially healthy again. We need to start building planes again, and that's going to take a lot of time. That's going to take months, possibly long into next year, until they are back to where they were pre-strike. And even then, pre-strike, this was not a healthy company. They went into the strike with a lot of issues, so this was going to take a long time for them to repair their finances, to get the production back up, so a lot of work waiting for the company.
Well, if you listen to the CEOs, and we did yesterday, to Michael O'Leary, he was here in the House, he said, look, it's a pain. I can't get my hands on aircraft. My numbers are being constrained by this. How quickly can they ramp up? And then how quickly do they get to certification of new models?
Well, as you say, you can never look at Boeing or Airbus, this duopoly in isolation. They really, whatever they do, it sort of seeps into the market. We heard from O'Leary yesterday saying we were expecting a lot more planes this year and next year. That's not happening, and that's really feeding through to our bottom line. And Ryanair might be one of the biggest customers for Boeing, but they're certainly not the only ones. There's a lot of customers out there waiting for Boeing to get production back up. They want to be at sort of 38. That's sort of their base case of a healthy production line. For the 737, that's their most widely bought model. But right now they're at 0, so you have to go from 0 to 38, and that's going to be a slow ramp up. They have already cautioned that they will continue to lose money this year. Cash will flow out, and it'll continue to flow out next year in the first half. So really the next 6 months financially are sort of a write-off, and it's really only in the latter part of next year when they will properly start making money again, provided that nothing else goes wrong.
Benny, we appreciate it. That is Bloomberg's Benedict Campbell there. This is Bloomberg.
Is on. Everything you need to get the edge at the end of the market day.
Big tech earnings kick off later this afternoon.
Gilead is coming out right now.
We have take 2 numbers. Back to the markets, right? Our bread and butter.
NVIDIA is one of the best stories in the tech space.
That actually matters a whole lot more.
It might shock some of your viewers.
You're watching The Close.
Get ahead of tomorrow's trading with The Close. Weekdays on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Bringing you up-to-the-minute financial news whenever and wherever it happens. I'm Michael McKee at the Federal Reserve, and this is Bloomberg.
Always on the heartbeat of the tech
spread across global markets.
The real-time data aspect is going to be important.
We're going to bring you expert analysis on that. Sure.
Don't miss Bloomberg's interview with the
Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
We thought we'd take a look at Bitcoin versus the S&P 500.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people.
A tectonic shift emanating from Washington.
It's really a tale of two cities in crypto.
Crypto shouldn't be partisan.
The transactions.
Really a record-breaking moment.
Crypto VC is back.
And the technology.
It's really the beginning of a global on-chain economy.
And if America doesn't embrace it, we're going to be left behind.
Bloomberg Crypto, only on Bloomberg. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ, only on Bloomberg.
It's Bloomberg Brief. I'm Manus Craney alongside Danny Berger here in New York. The polls are open in New Hampshire, with more states, including New York and New Jersey, Connecticut, joining in just a moment. 8 minutes away at 6 a.m. Get into the queue. The results of this election will have far-reaching economic consequences, to say the least. At stake is how Americans are taxed, how much prices will rise, as well as the country it trades with and how it does that with the rest of the world. Enda Curran is in Washington. Enda, good morning to you. There's a wonderful line from Maya McGuinness. This is an Oprah tax environment. You get a tax cut, you get a tax cut, you get a tax break. In terms of tax, how clear is the water between Trump and Harris?
Oh, look, there's definitely clear water between both candidates, Manus, like you say. On taxation, former President Trump wants to bring down the corporate tax rate to maybe 15%. He will leave individual tax rates untouched. And of course, then he has a sweep of other measures promised, like no tax on overtime, no tax on tips, for example. And then on the other side of the debate, Vice President Harris, she will leave individual taxes below the $400,000 bracket untouched, but she wants to increase the corporate rate of tax and increase taxes on wealthier individual Americans as well, while also offering tax breaks for small business and, of course, the family tax credit that both sides are talking about. So net tax is front and center in this campaign. The criticism from observers is that both tax policies really just add to the deficit rather than take away from the deficit, much more so on former President Trump's side, of course. By one estimate, the deficit would be twice the size under President Trump than it would be under Harris. But fiscal and tax very much front and center in this campaign.
To that point, and both candidates, should either of them win, or obviously one of them are going to win, they're going to be handed an economy that is strong. It's the first election in some time that we aren't dealing with a recession, a crisis, something happening in the economy. Considering the place of strength that we're coming in, how resilient will this economy be to various types of policy put in place by the candidates?
Well, there's no doubt it has been very strong going in. As you say, Danny, you have GDP growth in the third quarter stronger than expected. You have a labour market that it's softening, but unemployment is still at 4.1%. That's quite low. And you have consumers, both spending and consumer confidence high. So there's definitely significant strength underneath the bonnet there. But the problems, of course, like you mentioned, are the fact that interest rates are so high. Inflation has slowed a lot, but prices remain high. And of course, on the fiscal side, then there's clearly going to have to be some spending decisions made, no matter who takes the White House and Congress next year. So I think next year, regardless of who's in charge, there will be a lot of debate over the direction of fiscal policies. What decisions will they be making? Where will the hard decisions be made? Especially if it's a divided Congress, there will have to be negotiations and bartering in terms of what sort of fiscal arrangements they can get through. And that's where you might see some of these trade-offs coming up. So right now, whoever does win will get a pretty strong economy, but next year they are facing some big questions.
So much still unknown at this point. Bloomberg's Enda Curran, thank you so much for trying to answer some of those questions. Okay, let's get you set up for your trading day on this Tuesday. Election polls will be opening in states including Connecticut, Virginia, New Jersey, New York at 6 a.m. Eastern. ISM Services PMI data, that comes out at 10 a.m. And don't miss our election special coverage starting at 5 p.m. Eastern. I'll be joining the team from 7 p.m. to midnight as polls close around the country, Manus.
We'll be back together tomorrow morning, take you through this volatility, bond volatility, one-year high, FX volatility. They are skittish in the FX market, to say the least. But as Enda says, it's going to come down not just to who wins the presidential. We may not know that for 4 days. 2020, it was 4 days. But the shape of Congress.
Yeah, we'll see how risk assets react to whether we have results or whether we don't have results, if there's relief or if it looks like something else. Okay, that's it for the brief. Surveillance will take things from here.
will show you how to get the best funding for your startup idea. Let's get started. Here's the deal. If you have an amazing startup idea and need funds to fuel it, we're here to help. Simply send us a video where you explain your idea. Make it clear, concise, and compelling. Hook us in with your passion and vision. Don't forget to include your contact details so investors can reach out directly. This is your chance to shine and get your idea in front of people who can make it a reality. Imagine turning your startup dream into a thriving business. It all starts with that one simple step. So what are you waiting for? Grab your phone, hit record, and let your idea fly. The future of your startup could be just one video away. Remember, be clear, be passionate, and most importantly, be you. We can't wait to see what you've got. Let's get funded now.
Path of emissions, and someone who said, hey, nobody's ever scaled things up very like the speed that we knew to before. They're welcome to say, hey, I'll believe this when I see it. You know, in the meantime, some people who care about this issue are really out, you know, trying to think, do we need permitting reform? You know, do we find, what new ideas haven't we found yet? You know, how do we fund people with those new ideas? How do we get the costs of these things down? How do we collaborate on a global basis? So we're still not at the point where it's guaranteed or even that it'll be easy, but at least there's a theory of change.
You know, Steve was a teacher. He taught me the value of focus, the importance of simplicity, the fact that making things simple is so much harder than making things complex. For those of us that were fortunate enough to work with him, he was the teacher of a lifetime. My first job was delivering papers. And I was about 12 years old. Everybody was sort of expected to work in my family. And I'd get up at 3 in the morning, pick up the stack of papers and start throwing. And usually come back and take a nap before school. Throwing papers helped start my college education. And I was the first person in my family that went to college. I knew that being able to do that was a privilege that I needed not to waste. Everyone saw college in those days, and hopefully today, as opening many doors and being able to stand on the shoulders of your parents, that education would do that.
Surveillance starts right now. The day has finally arrived. It's Election Day 2024. And here are the scores. Equity futures on the S&P 500 elevated by 0.2%, up by 1/3 on the NASDAQ 100. On November 3rd, 2020, 33.69 on the S&P 500. We've come a long way. We've come even further in the bond market. 2-year, 10-year, 30-year. The 2-year 4 years ago, 16 basis points. Right now, 417.23. It's been quite a journey.
And this is the reason why the bond market is at the epicenter of a lot of the expected volatility. We are at such a different moment, post-pandemic, post-inflation surge, post all of the stimulus that got pumped into the economy that surged some of the debt levels. So it raises the question, how much more oxygen in the room is there for any of the proposals that we're hearing on either side of the aisle?
The eyes of the world on 7 swing states. I think we need to talk about the process. Why this evening could be long, why this week could be even longer.
Well, it could be long because it could take a long time to count all of these votes. You already have 83 million Americans who've already went out and voted. Some of those are early voting, some of those are mail-in ballots. Maricopa County. If it comes down to Arizona, we might be here for 10, 13 days, as those election officials told us that will take them to count those ballots. So in 2020, the election was called 4 days after the election. It was called on a Saturday. In 2016, it was called the following day. If they're quick, maybe we get it in the middle of the night. What was it, 3 a.m. in 2016? If it's 2020, it's going to be a few days.
We're all conditioned by experience. I think the problem is that over the last 10 years, we've had two very different experiences. Back in 2016, the polls missed that big move, that big shift towards Donald Trump. In 2022, for the midterms, we sat around this table and talked a million times about the importance of the economy. It's about the economy. It's about inflation. Republicans are going to wipe the floor with the Democrats. And then it was about something else. It was about abortion. And the Democrats held steady.
Implicit in your comment, which is the right comment to make, is that we don't trust the polls. And there is a feeling in the polls that this might be the closest election ever in history. And yet what we get the sense from a lot of even pollsters, Nate Silver, for example, coming out and saying they are crowding. They are doing things with these polls that basically don't make sense to me. They are basically only revealing the polls that agree with the general narrative that we have, which was the reason why the Ann Seltzer poll was so interesting in Iowa. She said, it surprised me too, but we can't just choose what we publish. We have to publish the data that we actually get.
If the Ann Seltzer poll is correct, you're going to see a pink wave from this election. This is the first presidential election after the Dobbs decision. And while, yes, the economy has maintained the top issue, is that what people in the voting booth go and end up voting on? We don't know yet. If it comes down to the economy, Oxford Economics says in one swing state of Pennsylvania that everyone is focused on, that a mass amount of money has been spent on, a mass amount of time from both these candidates. If it's inflation and the cost of living, they say Trump wins by 90,000 votes. If it's something else, is it Dobbs? Harris wins by, they say, 70,000 votes.
That's your day ahead. Here's your next hour. Coming up on the program, Julian Emanuel of Evercore saying the bull market will continue past the election. We'll catch up with Rob Casey of Signum Global Advisors as Harris and Trump make their closing arguments. And we'll speak to Veronica Clark of Citi, calling for a 50 basis point Fed rate cut in December. We begin this hour with Trump and Harris locked in a dead heat on Election Day in America. Polls showing a tight race across these 7 key swing states that will likely decide the election. Let's get to our team coverage of the Trump and Harris campaigns with Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall in Florida and Skylar Woodhouse in Washington, D.C. Tyler, describe the mood in Florida going into this one.
Yeah, good morning, John. We are here in Palm Beach waiting for former President Donald Trump to touch down early this morning. This is where he's expected to rally his supporters later tonight for an election night watch party as those results start to pour in. But before that happens, though, he also has something else big on his agenda, which is that he needs to vote himself. He's a registered voter here in Florida, of course, and opted not to early vote despite previously waffling on the issue. And nearly 82 million Americans already casting ballots heading into election day. But it is clear that he's going to use this as an example to supporters because at this point in the race, it is all about turnout. Now, we heard him use his final rallies going into today to urge his voters to get out to the vote, but also to air some grievances in what appeared to be a final push by his campaign to capitalize on what they see as a dissatisfaction among voters with the status quo. I can tell you, John, that our most recent Bloomberg News Morning Console poll shows that 68% of likely voters in the 7 key battleground states say that the country is on the wrong track. Whether or not Trump convinced enough voters that he is the one to fix that remains one of the big questions heading into today.
Skylar, let's bring you in. What's the closing message for the vice president?
The vice president yesterday campaigned all day in Pennsylvania. She put all of her final efforts in the Commonwealth, key battleground state, to determining who will return to the White House. And one thing I want to highlight that I thought was particularly interesting is yesterday, during one of her campaign stops in Pennsylvania, she went to a Puerto Rican restaurant with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Governor Josh Shapiro. Now, she went to this Puerto Rican restaurant because her campaign, Democrats, have been trying to make those final inroads with the Puerto Rican community, which has a large presence in Pennsylvania, and they're trying to play some catch-up against the Republican Party and Donald Trump as they have made significant inroads with the Latino community, Puerto Ricans. So the campaign is trying to play some catch-up, and I did think that was interesting last night that, you know, as the clock was winding down, that is a stop they committed to. But also in her closing argument, she was really focused on the contrast between her and former President Donald Trump. And she's really leaning into that as she, you know, makes those final speeches, does those final media rounds to get that point across to voters that it's either we have a new generation come in and, you know, take over the White House, or we go back to the former President Donald Trump. And she has really tried to lean into, you know, preserving democracy, to lean against what Donald Trump Part 2 could look like.
On the final push, Skylar Woodhouse alongside Tyler Kendall. To the both of you, thank you. Equity futures on the S&P 500 higher here by 0.2%. Joining us around the table, Julian Emanuel of Evercore. Julian, good morning.
Good morning.
What are you telling clients about this one? How different is this compared to other election cycles you've lived and traded through?
So the first thing to say is there's been a lot of hand-holding because the partisans that we talk to, both the Republicans and the Democrats, feel as if if the other side wins, that there's a potential that you get a series of negative events that could adversely impact both the markets and the economy. And the fact is, even though the polls are as tight as they are now, the evidence doesn't support that in the least. Interestingly enough, when you've had, and this feels to all of us, maybe because of the social media saturation, et cetera, that this is the closest race in history. It's not. There have been a number of races where we come into November and the margin is 2, 1, or 0. I guess this one is 0 probably. And guess what? The stock market has gone up into year-end 6 out of 7 times. People put their partisan hats aside and recognize the fact that we're in a good earnings cycle, we're in a good economic cycle, and the Fed is going to cut rates.
This really is the tone that I've heard in so many different strategists' notes, that essentially the economy is doing well, we're coming from a good place, companies are earning, everyone's holding their breath, waiting for an outcome, and then they can keep on going with what they were doing before. How offsides would this market be if there were a surprise, whether it be a sweep or whether it be, say, a contested election that drags on for more than a week?
So to us, over the last month or so, we've been making the point that our 6,000 year-end price target, which we've had for some time, is now a probability-weighted number based on whether it's a sweep or a divided and uncontested outcome or a divided and contested outcome. And again, history is informative here. In years where the stock market is this strong, this late in the year, the propensity is that you get a performance chase. And if we get what I would call a clean outcome, whichever side wins, that's where you go to 6,000, that's where you go through 6,000. Conversely, if this drags on into next week or the week after, you get a type of sell-off that the kind on the order that we saw in 2000, down 5 to 10 to 12%, which we think will be a buying opportunity.
What's so interesting to me is a couple of weeks ago, even months ago, people were talking about how this time is different and that this election cycle is somehow going to set the trajectory for the next 12 months. You could potentially make the difference between a 10-year yield at 5% or a 10-year yield at 3.5%. It could necessarily mean the difference between an investment cycle and not. Are you saying that's not true? That as long as we get a clean outcome, the trajectory for equities and the trajectory for the economy is pretty much going to be the same?
Look, we know that both sides' policies are likely to expand the deficit, okay? That's very clear. It's likely to underpin inflation. That's certainly part of the narrative as to why yields have risen. But if you think about it, it's also the fact that down to 3.6% in September, you were pricing in a recession, and there's no evidence of that whatsoever. And then the other thing to us is very informative here. There's only been one other time in history where the Fed has cut interest rates and the 2-year yield has risen in the manner in which it has risen over the last month and a half. And that was 1995, a pretty darn good time for stocks. We think that's going to continue.
Julie, I want to come back to what you said about you don't think this election is close. But historically, 2016, 2020, they were close. Trump won the blue wall with 77,000 votes in 2016. That's as close as you can get.
No, we do think this election is close. What we're saying is this is not the only one that is. But 2012, you came in with not knowing between Romney and Obama. Other elections similar. But the point again being that, and I will tell you, we spent the weekend in Battleground, Michigan, in a suburban community in Detroit, where you had Harris Wall signs, and 20 feet away the next yard were Trump Vance signs.
Were you counting?
It was very, very even, but those people are going to put their signs away and get on with their lives in a couple of days.
This has nothing to do with the markets, but since you were there, what was your takeaway? I got my Susan B. Anthony dollar. Let's flip the coin.
I'll tell you a company that can't wait to see the back of this, Marriott International. The CFO said this about hotel bookings. A key measure of hotel demand declining in November by double that of past election cycles. This is really weighing on business activity this time around.
Why make a bigger statement about what you're going to do, regardless of whether it favors one or the other, if you're going to become potentially a political punching bag, which we've already seen has come up with different corporate actions. I'm thinking of Nippon Steel. I'm thinking of even Ford and their factories down in Mexico. It is very difficult to make a bold move at a time where everything can become a meme for a political campaign.
Julian, it's good to see you. Appreciate your time. You staying up late?
I think so.
Okay. Julian Emmanuel of Evercore, thank you, sir. Equity futures on the S&P 500 up by 0.2%, with an update on stories elsewhere. With your Bloomberg brief, here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. European and U.S. intelligence officials believe Russia is behind a plan to place incendiary devices on cargo planes bound for North America. German security services think a parcel that caught fire at an airport in July was probably planted by Russia. The officials tell Bloomberg they're taking the alleged plot seriously and expect Moscow to attempt similar acts in the future. Last night, Joe Rogan announced his endorsement for former President Donald Trump. In a post on X, the popular podcaster praised the, quote, great and powerful Elon Musk, saying he made the most compelling case for Trump you'll ever hear. The endorsement could offer a boost to the Trump campaign, given Rogan's popularity among young men. Palantir shares, those are surging in the pre-market trade, up 13%. It reported quarterly revenue that beat analyst estimates. It also raised its forecast for operating income in the current period, citing higher demand in the U.S. for AI software. Shares of Palantir, those are up 140% so far in this year. And that's your brief, John.
Danny, thank you. More from Danny in about 30 minutes' time. Up next on the program, it's Election Day in America.
With your vote tomorrow, we can fix every single problem our country faces and lead America.
It is time for a new generation of leadership in America.
The closing arguments up next, live from New York City this morning. Good morning.
Investors, top executives, global innovators. Join me for in-depth conversations with the biggest newsmakers on the day's top stories. Insight with Haslinda Onen, only on Bloomberg.
Morning, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda.
Taking you from the U.S. market's close to the overnight session in Asia. We'll walk you through what you need to know to kickstart the European trading day. Live from our European headquarters, we bring you the day's top market-moving stories, unmatched expert analysis, and on-the-ground reporting from across the continent. Tune in every weekday at 6 a.m. London time, only on Bloomberg Television.
There is this real momentum from Wall Street.
We are basically deep in the European earnings season.
Take a look at how we're faring when it comes to Asian markets.
Equity futures on the S&P 500 up by 0.2%. In the bond market, yields lower yesterday, a little bit higher this morning, up 2 basis points. The 10-year 4.30.90. Under surveillance this morning, it's Election Day in America.
My message to Americans tonight is simple. We do not have to live this way. We don't. We don't, and we won't. We won't. We do not have to settle for weakness, incompetence, decline, and decay. With your vote tomorrow, we can fix every single problem our country faces and lead America.
It is time for a new generation of leadership in America, and I am ready ready to offer that leadership as the next president of the United States of America.
So here's the latest. Donald Trump and Kamala Harris closing out their campaigns in a final push across key battleground states. The candidates coming into Election Day locked in a tie across nearly every major polling outlet. Rob Casey of Signum Global Advisors with a confident call on the race, writing, "Our base case expectation has been and firmly remains that Vice President Kamala Harris will win the presidency at 65% odds." Rob joins us now for more. Rob, good morning.
Good morning.
2016 or 2022? How does this one break?
I think it's 2022. Republicans voting early, better than 2020, but I think Democrats close the gap today.
2022, of course, abortion, reproductive rights on the ballot. They are again this time in places like Nevada and Arizona. How important is that going to be?
Really important. Interestingly, in Nevada and Arizona, we're not seeing women turn out quite as much as we would have expected. Elsewhere, I think abortion is on the ballot nationally. We're seeing that in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, in the blue wall. It's a huge issue. In some states and in some polls, it's as big of an issue as the economy today. And so we're seeing that drive turnout, among many voters, especially women.
So you're optimistic after you saw Ann Seltzer's poll over the weekend. You think potentially this could be a pink wave?
Yeah, well, I think Ann Seltzer is one of the best to do it, and her poll may wind up being an outlier. Of course, it had Harris +3 in Iowa. We don't think Harris is going to win in Iowa, but Seltzer is one of the best to do it. That +3 was driven by women turning out more, older women turning out more for Harris. We do think we could see that across the country.
Older women who remember Roe and now remember Dobbs in their lifetime. What's her path to 270?
Well, the easiest path is the blue wall. It's holding everything constant, sort of the states that will fall blue or fall red. If she wins Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, that's 270 on the dot, as long as she wins the one electoral college vote in Nebraska, which she will. From there, if she loses Pennsylvania, it gets much more difficult, but then she'll be looking to North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. She'll have to win 2 of those 4 to get to 270.
Out of those Sun Belt states, which 2 do you think is most likely she could keep or flip?
Well, I would say Nevada, which Harris is running much worse in Nevada than she should be, much worse than Biden was in 2020. But Democrats have a phenomenal turnout machine in Nevada. It's the Senator Harry Reid machine. So I think she closes the gap that Republicans have gotten in early voting. Georgia and North Carolina, very similar states. But I think Georgia, we've seen it move bluer and bluer and bluer, in large part thanks to Stacey Abrams, among others. So I think Georgia, Nevada, maybe North Carolina. The one state where Harris really is underperforming is Arizona. Trump is up 2 to 3 points. That's actually a pretty wide gap. We always like to say, or everybody likes to say, it's a 50-50 race. I don't think it's 50-50 in Arizona.
So I don't have any really feeling on this, and I keep thinking about how I have no edge on this. And so when I try to sound smart, I go predictit.org, and I say, okay, well, who's winning? And then I can give a sense of exactly what's going on in markets and understand this. You think that that's all inaccurate. You think that actually the betting markets are completely skewed. Why?
Well, listen, the betting market that is the most skewed is Polymarket, and that's thanks to a trader in, I believe it's France, who's put in at least $40 million. That was the number last week on Trump. Apparently his family doesn't know that he's doing it, but, good luck to him today.
It's like a 10-year-old in the basement.
For us, the betting markets are a really interesting indicator of direction, right? Move towards Trump over the past couple of weeks, frankly, have moved towards Harris over the past couple of days. But in terms of actual probability, if you look at the political science research, and I'm not a political scientist, but if you look at the research, betting markets are where they differ from polls, they get it wrong, and polls are more accurate.
Okay, but polls have also been sort of raked under the coals or over the coals, whatever the expression is. I'm just wondering, it seems like people don't trust polls to be getting it right. Nate Silver has come out and he has excoriated the pollsters for basically only releasing results that seem to work with this narrative that it really is a neck-and-neck race. Do you think that that's accurate? Do you think that people are purposely overlaying their actual raw results with models to try to adhere to this basically 50-50 narrative in the market?
Yeah, well, Nate Silver's a lot smarter than I am. So when he talks about polling and process, polling process, I listen. It is statistically improbable that we are getting all of these 48, 47 races in all of the swing states all the time, right? If there's an average amount of variance, we would see plus or minus 3 like we saw in Iowa over the weekend. Pollsters are doing the best that they can, but we have to remember it's a subjective, it's an art and not a science, right? So whether or not they're putting their thumb on the scale, they always have to put their thumb on the scale because they have to decide how they're going to collect the poll, the process for collection, and the process for sampling, who they're going to talk to and who they're going to listen to. That's always an art and not a science.
There's a few Senate races to watch tonight. You mentioned Arizona, so Ruben Gallego, Carrie Lake, won. Over in Pennsylvania, Casey McCormick. What are the others that you're really closely following later this evening?
Oh, yeah, it's Arizona, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. I think that those are the most important for Democrats to hold if they're going to have any shot of holding the Senate. Now, to be clear, at Signum, we don't think that Democrats will hold the Senate. West Virginia obviously goes Republican. We think Senator John Tester in Montana. I mean, it's been a bad bet to bet against Tester over the past couple of cycles, but we think in this election we're not going to see the split ticket voting that we've seen previously. He loses in Montana, and then so that very quickly becomes a Republican 51-49 majority. Elsewhere, I would look at Pennsylvania and Ohio. And, you know, if you want a surprise or at least some upside silver lining for Democrats, you're looking at Nebraska, you're looking at Texas.
Tell us about Texas. Is it possible that Ted Cruz can lose his seat?
Well, listen, Congressman Colin Allred has run a phenomenal campaign. I think he's essentially hitting the ceiling of what a Democrat can do in Texas today. Texas is moving blue. I think eventually Texas will be blue. That will change the entire map. We think Ted Cruz holds on to his seat in this cycle. Allred's running a great campaign, but I just don't think Democrats are there statewide to win. I mean, we saw very similar numbers coming out of the Beto O'Rourke-Ted Cruz race. Beto ran a great campaign as well, wound up coming up short, and in fact was leading in polling more so than Allred has. So we think Cruz wins that seat.
So you think the Senate goes red, but is it 51 or 54?
51.
51.
All of the Democratic incumbents hold their seats. Gallego wins in Arizona, but because of West Virginia and Montana, I mean, Republicans have a pretty easy path to 51.
So all of us are going to be basically not sleeping for the next 24 hours, and you're going to see us in really disgruntled and disheveled form over the next remainder of the week. We also get a Fed decision. I'm just curious, after this whole election is over, which party do you think has the bigger reckoning? What does that reckoning look like? And this is a question John raised earlier this week, and honestly, I think it's one of the most important ones that we're going to be facing.
Yeah, well, if Harris loses, I think the progressives, you know, from the left are really going to do their best to pull Democrats left over the next 2 years before the midterms. That's not our base case, but I do think that that's a pretty clear path forward for Democrats. It's hard to get much more centrist than the current Democratic machinery, regardless of what you think about Kamala Harris. If Trump loses, we actually have a little bit of an internal debate at Signum. I think the upside, you know, for all of us, and particularly for the Republican Party, is they're able to move on from Trump, you know, amicable break pretty quickly, and they allow the next generation to move up. I think it's going to be a lot harder, a lot easier said than done. Donald Trump if he loses, he's going to have a lot of legal challenges to face. It's a lot easier to do that as the head of a major party than it is sort of cast to the side. So I think he's going to hold on to power for longer and more vigorously than maybe some other Republicans would like.
Can you think of a single person that's in a position right now to step in and pick up the pieces if he stepped aside?
It would be really challenging because it needs to be someone that has the MAGA bona fides, but also those people that are trending well in the Republican Party are a little bit more centrist. Look at Nikki Haley, but she's brushed aside, and she's persona non grata for MAGA camp.
Rob, it's good to see you.
Great to see you.
Rob Casey there of Signum Global Advisors. If you are just joining us, equity futures right now on the S&P up by 0.2%. Though as you will hear repeatedly throughout today, into the afternoon and into the evening and night, this could be a very, very long week ahead of us.
Are you trying to telegraph your day ahead, John? Is that basically what you're feeling? I mean, honestly, we've heard this from everybody. This is what everybody's kind of hunkering down to try.
I'm suggesting this might take a while. Is it going to be 2016? I was on air that night. It was about 2:30 Eastern time. That's when we finally wrapped this all up. And you kind of knew as we were drifting through the night which direction it was going. 2016, I know exactly where I was. I was walking through Hyde Park with this one, Anne Marie. And then we found out about 4 p.m. local time in the UK.
So
on a Saturday.
Write in what your takeout orders are going to be as everyone stays up all night. I'm curious to know what the snacks of choice are. We can compare notes.
We'll see how long it takes. Up next on a program, don't forget, there's a Fed decision later this week. A call from Citigroup just around the corner.
many global investors that aren't interested in China anymore, but there's a lot that are. And obviously the local investors have money in China and are doubling down on investing in China. Many of the Asian investors, and in fact a lot of the Middle East investors, the Americans are gone away. Therefore, there's an amazing opportunity to put capital to work and get returns which are excess what you would get in other places. Where there is lack of money, there is usually opportunity. So we continue to build out our business in China. It's just where the money's coming from is different. And so we're raising local money in China for investing and bringing those that choose to be there to invest in China. So it's just a different, where the money's coming from is just different.
Jumpstart your trading day on Bloomberg Open Interest.
2 hours of single stock stories that are driving the opening bell action. We'll take you to Wall Street, Main Street, the C-suite, and beyond.
These are companies that are growing their market.
The great companies in the U.S. are the companies hitting the cutting edge. That's a different story.
Get the inside track on what's buzzing in markets.
With the players who are shaping the narrative.
If you have bad earnings reports, you're going to get punished.
They're not buying what the industry is selling. Join us on Bloomberg Open Interest. Every trading day, only on Bloomberg.
Equities with a small bounce, up 0.25% on the S&P 500. On the Nasdaq 100, we're up by 0.4%, after declining just a little bit yesterday. For the bigger moves, they're in the bond market. So last week, the 2-year and 10-year up by double digits, then yesterday down by double digits. You're keeping up with all of this. We're up by 2 this morning. 430.90 on a US 10-year. On a 2-year, 417.23. Just a feeling that the polls started to rebalance towards Harris over the weekend, which injected this bid into the bond market Monday morning.
Yeah, but as you pointed out, that bid is 10 basis points, 15 basis points at one point. And basically, you're talking about the bond market at the epicenter of volatility for this election cycle. That, to me, I think is the takeaway from what you're saying. I do want to just make a note. Yesterday, we had a 3-year auction. Normally, 3-year auctions are pretty easy. They typically are digested pretty well. This one, not so much. And today we have a 10-year auction and tomorrow a 30-year auction at a time where there is this much skittishness around the U.S. bond market. I am watching that very closely.
Yeah, it's an interesting time to drop a 30-year auction tomorrow afternoon. We'll see what kind of backdrop we've got for that. Let's look at the FX market together. So the euro stronger, 109. The dollar weaker over the last 24 hours. The bigger move in dollar mex. Mexican peso starting this week with a strong rally. That's the trade story, front and center to start the week.
Basically, the argument here is if Donald Trump gets into office, and even more so if there's a red sweep, there could be some substantial tariffs placed on Mexico, which would be dollar strength, and that would be peso weakness. And that's the reason why that's become one of the proxies. I think it's interesting to see where traders have honed in on what the proxies are. And sometimes you can tell more about that than you could tell even about who's going to win or what the policies are.
Yeah, because that's not about a sweep. That's about a presidency.
Correct.
That's about tariffs. The rest of it, if you're thinking about yield differentials and things like that, that's about the sweep. That's about what happens with tax cuts and what happens to the budget in America. So you're taking a temperature in different ways across foreign exchange, which is something to keep an eye on through this week.
Yeah, and especially at a time where essentially tonight, when everybody is taking snacks, I still haven't gotten word from other people about what their snacks are going to be tonight.
Celsius.
Celsius is not a snack, but I do think that going forward, there is a real question about, what people are going to be reading into with the polls that come out, and how they trade, and what these proxies say, and how narratives get created. And that, I think, is going to be one of the most interesting aspects.
Well, if you remember in 2020, you first had all the individuals who voted that day, and it looked like a red sweep across the country. But then you had to say, settle down. They're still counting votes. And it was Democrats who decided to do mail-in voting, mail-in ballots. And in a place like Pennsylvania, you cannot start counting those. Even if you got them 2 weeks prior, you cannot start counting them until the day of. So that is why everyone needs to take a deep breath. And it could take a few days, maybe even a week.
Maybe even longer than that. We'll see. Equity futures right now in the S&P up 0.2%. Under surveillance this morning, election day in America, polls showing Kamala Harris and Donald Trump locked in a tight race across several key swing states that will decide the next president. The polls are incredibly tight, and everyone is conditioned by, I think, 2 very, very unique significant election cycles. The presidency in 2016 and the midterms of 2022. because one is pre and post a very important decision that took place in this country.
Well, we spoke to Speaker McCarthy recently, and he was basically, his vibe was that this was going to be red across the board. And then I said, well, yeah, but you said there was going to be a red wave in 2022. And he said, well, yeah, maybe not exactly. We need to look at historically Donald Trump. He's won one election, 2016. Then there was the 2018, they lost the House by some 41 seats Democrats were able to pick up. 2020, this is when he lost again, when he ran for president, and they also were able to flip the Senate, the Democrats. And now he's up again in 2024. And are voters going to give him another shot, even though we've seen a long list of him losing elections, or are they going to say, we want something new in terms of individual, because she is an incumbent?
What I think is fascinating is that I remember 2 months ago, people thought that this was going to be a contested election, and you saw that in the options for the S&P 500. Completely faded. People are like, we're going to find out by tomorrow, it's fine. And basically, that's the tone of everyone who we've gotten around this table. Basically, the market will rally once we have an answer, and then we can all move on. And I don't know how much this is hope, and I don't know how much this is actually based on reality, but none of us really seem to have an edge.
Well, one thing I can say is we all share that hope.
Indeed.
I hope the optimists amongst us are correct. Let's turn to this one. Boeing. Workers voting to accept a new labor contract, ending a 53-day strike that's crippled production of the plane manufacturer. The new deal, including a 38% wage increase over 4 years and enhanced retirement contributions. That stock is up by 1.9%. There was some doubt yesterday, given that this has failed a few times already, that this would actually happen.
Including by Michael O'Leary of Ryanair, who came on here and said he thinks that why not hold out for 40% gains? I mean, why stop there? What you heard from the head of the union was, this was a defining moment. This is a victory. We stood strong. We stood tall. We won. Here is the question. What are they winning back to? What are they going to walk into at a time where this is a company that needs to reshape its business model and understand how quickly it can ramp up production to meet with Ryanair's demands that it seemed to be making yesterday?
Absolutely. There's a transition that is definitely happening at Boeing, but immediately these workers are going to get paid. They're getting, what, a $12,000 signing bonus. They're getting their health care benefits back. A sigh of relief at the White House. President Biden yesterday putting out a statement congratulating the support of his economic team, including Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su, NEC Director Lael Brainerd, and then goes in for this. Collective bargaining works. I wonder if slightly there's a little bit of an edge ahead of the election. Union Joe making a last statement about collective bargaining works. We're on the side of rank and file union members.
Michael O'Leary, those planes are going to Sweden, right?
Yeah.
And Italy.
Yeah, that's
not
right.
To the UK.
The ABBA Museum.
There we go.
Okay.
He was singing and dancing.
He was. He was very excited.
It's quite an interview. Lots of feedback about that. Let's turn to the final story here. A Pennsylvania judge rejecting a request to block Elon Musk's $1 million voter giveaway. Musk had been giving away $1 million a day to people who signed a petition calling for free speech and the right to bear arms. Philadelphia's district attorney calling it an illegal lottery.
So Musk's lawyers saying this isn't a lottery, this is a job. They say it, quote, represents a salary to voters rather than illegal lottery payouts. That person then becomes a spokesperson, part of this PAC. So they're basically saying this is a job, it is not a lottery, and that person is getting a salary.
Do those people know that?
I think those people thought they were picked at random as part of a lottery, but
it's actually unclear. Actually, the lawyer said that this isn't necessarily random, and these might not have been randomly selected. Look, there are a lot of questions around this, but there's a sense.
But do the people know that they were not randomly selected?
It's a good question. We don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty here. Either way, it can continue with literally today as being the day.
Got to find one of those guys and interview him and see what they've done with the cash over the last week or so. I'm interested.
Tesla?
Possibly. Discount?
Yes,
Is that
exactly.
illegal too? Possibly. There's one more key event coming up this week, the Fed rate decision. Economists widely expecting the Fed to cut rates by 25 basis points on Thursday. Veronica Clark of Citi is among them, adding, quote, the December rate cut decision will depend on labour market data, and we expect a further softening to lead to a 50 basis point rate cut. Veronica joins us now for more. Veronica, good morning.
Good morning.
Torsten Slok of Apollo on the programme earlier this morning with Danny and Manis saying that we'll get no cut in December. Maybe we hit pause. Why are we going 50?
Yeah, there does seem to be this, reflation kind of narrative in the last month or so in markets, but I think it's a little bit overdone at this point. On inflation alone, I think the Fed can be cutting. We did have a stronger September core PCE reading, but we saw ECI, Employment Cost Index last week. That's been slowing. Home prices that are still pretty soft. So I think they can be cutting on inflation alone. But I do think, we are seeing concerning signs in the labor market data, and this is a labor market that looks precarious at best, I think, and that would be what gets the Fed to go faster.
This Thursday, we might not know the outcome of the election. I hope by the time we get to the middle of December, we do.
Yeah.
So we should have a better idea of what the policies are for 2025. Could that shape their decision in any way?
Yeah, I don't think yet. I think in some sense, we're expecting more expansionary kind of policies, tax cuts, tariffs, maybe things that would raise price levels. But I think the Fed is going to be reacting to what we're seeing in current economic data, what the current conditions are, not projecting where we might be a year from now. If you did see some kind of inflationary impact from fiscal policies, they're going to wait to see that in the data before reacting.
There's a really interesting point underpinning that 50 basis point call of yours at a time where we're going to shift from who won the election to how much is the Fed going to cut rates again. I mean, basically, this has been sort of the parlor game in markets. There's a big question about how strong the economy is right now. And everyone who's come around this table says, actually, the economy is really strong heading into this election, and it's in a great position for anyone who wins this election. Right. You disagree. Why do you disagree?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, yes, consumers are still spending. We've still seen some strong investment data, but it really comes down to that labor market data. Obviously, we had a report on Friday that was weaker than expected. Markets didn't really react to it at all. Maybe there are temporary strike hurricane issues in that payroll number. But there were things in that report unrelated to those temporary factors that looked a lot weaker. We did have the unemployment rate rising on an unrounded basis, at least. We see the highest share of permanent job loss yet this cycle. We got some pretty big downward revisions to payrolls in previous months. In August, private payrolls rose by just 37,000 jobs. So this is a labor market that is slowing. We see labor demand pulling back. People are not quitting. People feel worse about their employment prospects, and that's a pretty concerning sign for the Fed.
At the same time, some people say it's just stagnating. This is just a frozen market. It's just that people aren't getting laid off, but they're also not getting hired, but they're not feeling terrible. And we were talking to Neela Richardson of ADP, and she was saying people actually feel more loyal to their employers, which tends to happen when the labor market is doing better and they're not worried about losing their job. So what makes you think that it's going to break to the layoff cycle?
Yeah, I would say some of the consumer confidence data around the labor market has looked more concerning. That labor market differential in the Conference Board survey, that's come down pretty substantially. I think the soft landing explanation for what we're seeing is, yes, we have very low hiring, very low quit rates, still low layoffs. We were coming from a couple-year period of very tight labor markets, people moving jobs, so maybe this is the natural pullback of that. But it looks like more than that to us. If you did just see people pulling back on hiring, you wouldn't expect current workers to be working less, but hours worked have come down. There's more part-time employment. This does feel like employers looking to cut labor costs to us. And yes, you haven't seen the big increase in layoffs yet, but that's really the last step and the concerning step for the Fed.
When do you think that could happen?
Honestly, any time now. This is kind of the usual tipping point of these cycles. I think it's been an important dynamic that we've seen quit rates dropping pretty substantially in the last couple months. I think for a lot of the last year or so, employers have been cutting labor costs by not hiring, not replacing workers, but suddenly if people are not quitting and you don't have open positions to not fill, that can get you to layoffs. We did see an increase in initial and continuing jobless claims the last month or so, and more than half of that was related to states not impacted by hurricanes, so it was not just temporary issues.
I want to ask you about politics because Elizabeth Warren yesterday, right on cue, the senator of Massachusetts, calling on Fed Chair Jay Powell to cut by 50 basis points. Is that at all possible this week?
This week, probably not. I think, of course, the Fed usually doesn't like to surprise us. We had a little bit of a divergence of that in September. I think this week it's very likely at 25. And I, in general, do believe that the Fed is not susceptible to political pressure.
I do wonder why Senator Warren's chosen to do this again. Why? Election week.
Well, she also put out a list of every time she's told the Fed to do so. So I just think this is more about her and less so about the election. She's looking through the election and only focused on Thursday.
Can we get a final word from you on the independence of the Federal Reserve and how things might change with a Trump win? What could things look like for months to come? Never mind letters from Senator Warren. How different might things be?
Yeah, I mean, I do at least, obviously for the next year, Powell is still Fed chair. Obviously, President Trump's first term, we had the debate of whether, Powell would be removed or not. Legally, can you do that? We're assuming that, Powell will stay, finish out his term until early 2026. And I do, in general, believe that the Fed is independent.
No open letters from the presidency telling Jay what to do?
Well, I don't know letters, but I think more tweets. If he was to win again, I think it would be truths.
Yeah.
But that's going to be the vibe, a lot of jawboning.
Veronica, good to see you. Veronica Clark of Citi, looking for a 50 basis point reduction of the Federal Reserve in December and 25 this week on Thursday. With an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg brief, let's cross over to Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Hurricane season continues on. Tropical storm Rafael has formed in the Caribbean. It's the Atlantic's 17th storm of this season. According to the U.S. National Hurricane Center, it has top winds of 45 miles per hour. Hurricane warnings and watches have been posted for the Cayman Islands and Cuba, and a tropical storm for the Florida Keys. Employees of the New York Times Tech Guild have gone on strike. The guild represents over 600 software developers and other back-end specialists who oversee digital aspects at the Times. The employees claim that they gave the Times months of notice before deciding to go on strike, but failed to reach an agreement on a contract. OpenAI has begun prelim discussions with regulators to transform its nonprofit structure into a for-profit business. According to two people familiar with the matter, OpenAI is in early talks with the California Attorney General's office over the process to change its corporate structure. Becoming for-profit would make it more attractive to investors, but could open the door to ethical questions on its original do-gooder public mission. And that's your brief, John.
Danny, thank you. Appreciate it. More from Danny in 30 minutes' time. Up next on the program, repricing election bets.
If you get a Trump victory, I think the odds of a bear steepener, that's pretty likely. But under a Harris administration, it's more likely to be a bull steepening.
What did Lisa say last week? Choose your own adventure. Do just that. From New York, this is Bloomberg.
Why does this business model work? Because it's virgin space. It's never been done before, and it'll never be done again. When you step back and you look at something that's been golf through institutions has been the way it has been for 53 years without change. In 1993, I stepped back and said, okay, this is not right. It's doing the same old Groundhog Day. Everything's the same. Players are a pass-through entity. They're not getting any equity built in their day. Once they're done playing, they're out. I thought, that's just not right. When you have to build a sustainable model, you need to have these players, these famous, the world best, the best of the best. You need to give them equity into the future. You need to give them a vision of where they need to go and how they're going to get there.
It's the world's second largest economy with a growing influence in global affairs. But geopolitical uncertainties, deflationary pressures, and questions about foreign investment linger. Bloomberg, the China Show, brings you the unmatched expertise you need to keep track of breaking news, in-depth market analysis, and the most influential newsmakers in and around China. Bloomberg, the China Show.